G'day, May 40 here. So I found this new Trump administration absolutely intoxicating. And I probably live streamed a little bit too much over the past 3 months. And at times, I think I've been live streaming because I felt starved for human connection. And this was a way that I could connect with other people, but entirely on my own terms. So I could be safe and connect and control the connection. A lot of that's a delusion. Sometimes I've probably been live streaming to fill a hole in my soul with some attention and feedback. Other times to just immediately discuss an idea that has obsessed me. Other times I probably live stream to amuse myself. It's like, oh, let me show off my verbal dexterity or the superlative transcendent brilliance of my ideas. And then other times I hope that I live stream because I think I have something useful to say. And I got up at 4 a.m. to prepare for this show. And about an hour ago, I was just starting to listen to a Victor Davis Hanson lecture on Israel. And I caught myself like, why am I listening to Victor Davis Hanson talk about Israel? He's not an Israel specialist. I don't believe he speaks Hebrew. I don't believe he's fluent in Arabic or any of the major Middle Eastern languages. So why am I listening to what he has to say? And then I reflected, my best self would spend zero time listening to pundits. So if my best self would spend zero time listening to pundits, right? Why do I listen to pundits, right? My best self does not masturbate. My best self does not look at pornography. My best self does not enter conversations where I'm not wanted. My best self does not over-disclose because I'm feeling needy and I want to get some kind of connection. So why am I not living my best self throughout my life? And if my best self would spend zero time listening to pundits, why am I listening to pundits? And then I thought, well, I listen to pundits because I need a peer P-I-E-R, that I push off against. All right, when I listen to pundits, I often hear something stupid. And so that then gives me the energy, the strength, the determination, and the reason to write a blog post or to go live with some video commentary, because it's by listening to something that is false that I then can be spurred to feel like, oh, I've got a rare truth that I want to share. So to the extent that this show and my blog posts make a contribution, it is to the extent that I am honest about my own failures and that I have learned from my own failures, and then I can spot other people making similar failures to what I've made, and then I base so much of my commentary about international affairs, national affairs, politics, religion, and culture off my own experiences with failure. And to the extent that I am able to be honest with myself, it makes it pretty easy for me to spot when other people are being dishonest. And so if I make a contribution, it is I think in that realm, right? It's fairly easy for me to spot when other people are being dishonest. For example, you might have heard of a Hollywood movie producer, Scott Rudin, and he's produced a lot of Broadway shows and movies, and he got called out in the Me Too movement for being a bully. And now the New York Times had an article this week. Scott Rudin, producer, exiled for bad behavior, plans return to Broadway. He says he has a lot more self-control now. So based on my own failures with trying harder and my own failures with trying to exert my willpower so that I can build a better life, and my own failures with exerting my self-control, count me as skeptical that self-control, improved amounts of self-control, is going to lead to a better Scott Rudin. On the other hand, this may be just one thing that he says in a conversation with a journalist, and it may not be the most important thing that he has developed to be a better person. So there was something that he said that that rang true to me. He says, I don't want to let anybody down, not just myself, but my husband, my family, and my collaborators. And so from my own personal experience, when I feel connected to other people, when I have a sense of gratitude for the kindness that other people have shown me, I tend to make better choices, and I tend to see reality more clearly. I tend to have less resentment. So every time you have a resentment, every time you write someone up for a ticket for your unenforceable rule, right? My unenforceable rule, that just creates more stuff, more airplanes flying around in my brain as I try to act like the air traffic controller. To use an example from the great book Forgive for Good by that Stanford University psychologist, Fred Luskin. And so when I have gratitude, it's really hard for me to have resentment. And when I'm in the present moment, it's hard for me to have resentment. So when I let go of everything that I think I know, I notice that my shoulders and my neck and my back freeze up, my breathing comes easier, my performance is better because I've moved into a state of awareness rather than judgment. And when you're in a state of awareness, you're also in the present moment. And when you're in the present moment, you're not going to be filled with anger and resentment. You're not likely to be depressed or anxious. Present moment and the state of awareness, pretty cool place to hang out. Now, here are my exceptions. Here are pundits who I do think are worth my time. Steve Saylor, most of all, equally true with Steve Saylor. Christopher Caldwell, author Charles Murray, Peter Brimlow, Heather McDonald, and occasionally Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson. But I was initially taken aback. I thought, wow, my best self would spend zero time listening to someone like me. And then I thought, well, what the hell? What is my USP? What is my unique selling proposition? I thought, it's my occasionally honest understanding of my own failures, and then how understanding my own failures helps me better understand the world, understanding my own ability to be truthful and honest with myself. Then when I'm in that space, it's easier for me to spot when someone else is lying to me or manipulating me. So people have acted in bewildering ways to me in the past, but when I'm able to maintain this higher level of just honesty with myself, I just notice, hey, there's something off with what this person is saying. It does not ring true. I'm thrilled with this Trump administration, but at the same time, if I want to be honest, I have to admit that much of what Donald Trump says and does makes no sense to me. In fact, it seems downright counterproductive. So Donald Trump bullying Canada and bullying Denmark over Greenland, right? This seems stupid to me, right? Trying to make Canada a 51st state does not make sense. Trump's haphazard approach to tariffs does not make sense. And if I can just bring that level of honesty, then I think I'm doing a small service. I'm doing the right thing. Because when I look back on my life, how often have I been humiliated by trying to assume that I know things that I don't? I took geometry twice in high school, and both times I got a C grade, right? I didn't need to retake it. I didn't once consult a high school counselor after the mandatory initial consultation before I started public school in 10th grade. After that, I never consulted my high school counselor, and so I just got it into my head it'd be a good idea for me to retake geometry. And one day in geometry class, the teacher had given an assignment. I think I'd missed a day or two from illness. And when he was walking down the rows looking at our work, and when he came and looked at my work, he said, "You don't have a clue what we're doing, do you?" And his comment was devastating because it was accurate, and so many people have said the same thing to me. Though I think the most frequent question that has been posed to me over the course of my life has been, what the F is wrong with you? So I know when I pretend to understand things that I don't understand, I often get humiliated. But when I'm in reality, when I am clear about what I don't know, I don't tend to get humiliated. So if you're not getting humiliated, you're living in reality, right? You are being honest with yourself. So I put into grok, right? What stunning thing will Donald Trump do next? And I had no idea what grok was going to say, but I find this interesting. Trump may order a military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Given recent tensions and military buildup, the action would be in response to Iran's nuclear program. America has a lot of B-2 bombers at Diego Garcia, indicating preparation. So the evidence leans towards increased U.S.-Iran tensions. So Donald Trump said things on Friday about this. He was issuing a warning to Iran. It appeared that recent diplomatic efforts are failing. So Donald Trump has been actively engaging with Iran, and there is a notable military buildup with B-2 Spirit stealth bombers stationed at Diego Garcia, a strategic base in the Indian Ocean. So this deployment, capable of striking hardened targets like nuclear facilities, suggests a preparation for potential military action against Iran. Emotionally, I'd love this, in large part because I'm pro-Israel, and emotionally, I have a lot of negative feelings about Iran's Islamic regime, particularly since they seized American hostages, was it 1978, 79. So emotionally, I'd love it, but the critical thinking part of my brain is afraid that this would be a disaster. So my heart says one thing, bomb, bomb, bomb Iran. My head says another, don't bomb Iran. So Trump sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader wanting a military action if Trump does not agree to negotiate on its nuclear program. Iran's response was dismissive. And now Iran is threatening to strike Diego Garcia. I don't think it's clear that Iran has the capability of striking Diego Garcia. So ordering a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, that would be a dramatic and unexpected move. So that would fit the description of a stunning action, and it would pretty much reduce all other news stories to second place. All right, Trump is operating with a script right now of just overwhelming action, right? He's just flooding the zone. And so one possible explanation for many of his more bewildering, confusing actions is that he's just flooding the zone. He's just distracting so that he can get things done. So is there any importance to Grok answering my question? What stunning thing will Trump do next by mentioning a strike on Iran?
Without getting its own hands dirty. Now, the US has had enough. Iran is about to be hit hard as a massive US B-2 bomber deployment prepares to escalate the conflict in the Middle East. US President Donald Trump told Iran that this was coming. Still, Iran wouldn't stop supporting the Houthis, meaning it now faces one of the most terrifying weapons in the United States Air Force. Trump's warning to Iran came on the back of the first 4 days of US airstrikes conducted against the Houthi militant group in Yemen. That group, which has ties to Iran, believed to extend to training and weapons supply, reignited its attacks against container ships and commercial vessels in the Red Sea on March 12. America's response has been to launch daily airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, which Trump says are already proving effective. Tremendous damage has been inflicted upon the Houthi barbarians, and watch how it will get progressively worse, Trump posted to his social media site on March 19. It's not even a fair fight, and it never will be. They will be completely annihilated. While these comments may seem like bragging on the part of the US president, they actually contain a veiled message to Iran. Trump is telling Iran that one of its most important proxies doesn't stand a chance against the US. And he's not just saying it, the US Navy and Air Force are demonstrating that fact. The daily airstrikes in Yemen have killed at least 53 people and injured over 100 more, with the US claiming that it's managed to take out several members of the Houthi leadership already. And if there was any doubt about Trump's true target with these strikes, he cleared all of that up on March 19. In a separate Truth Social post, the US president said, "Iran must stop the sending of these supplies immediately. Let the Houthis fight it out themselves. Either way, they lose, but this way they lose quickly." And in a March 17 post, Trump then delivered his most direct warning yet. Every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran, and Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire. Did the US just declare war on Iran? Not quite. But Trump has sent a message that the US isn't going to stand by and watch as Iran funds and supports the Houthis in the militant group's Red Sea campaign. And again, these aren't empty words from Trump. He's following through on his promises of more strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. And perhaps more importantly, he's following through on the threats he's making against Iran. How? As we speak, the US is transporting B-2 stealth bombers to a military facility that is within range of Iran. On March 26th, the War Zone, or TWZ, posted a report claiming that a significant force of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers looks to be currently making its way to the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia. It cites satellite imagery from the previous 48 hours that seems to demonstrate that the US is amassing what could become a powerful fighting force on the UK-owned island. Diego Garcia is an interesting place. The BBC reports that it's a remote island nestled in the Indian Ocean, and to the outside observer, it might look like paradise on Earth. Lush vegetation sprouts from its fertile ground. Stunning and practically untouched white sand beaches taper off into crystal clear ocean waters. And as a holiday destination, it has the potential to become one of the most desirable getaways in the entire world. But the island isn't used for such leisurely purposes. Instead, it's the home of a US Navy support facility that gives the US eyes and ears in the Indian Ocean. The island is leased to the US by the UK, with the most recent lease renewal allowing the US to essentially use this tiny slice of paradise for whatever purposes it deems fit until 2036. Prior to March 2025, the island was home to several branch units of the United States military. These include a specific Diego Garcia detachment of the US Navy, along with the 36th Wing of the 11th Air Force of the US Pacific Air Forces. It even has a Space Operations contingent, with the 20th Space Control Squadron of Space Operations Command calling the island its home, along with the 21st Space Operations Squadron of Space Delta 6. Add detachments from the US Air Force's 515th Air Mobility Operations Wing to that list, as well as several supporting groups, and you get a remote island that's been transformed into one of the US's key Asian military bases. Those branch groups are still there. They're just being joined now by some of America's most powerful bombers. The US itself provides scant few details about what goes on at the base. According to the military installations website, entry to Diego Garcia is restricted, requiring area clearance by US Navy support facility Diego Garcia. Only unaccompanied military and Department of Defense civilian personnel or authorized contractors may be assigned to the island. In other words, nobody gets on or off Diego Garcia without express permission from the US military. So much for that vacation. US military personnel typically embark on a one-year tour if they're assigned to the island, with extensions only available to officers and enlisted personnel in special circumstances. Civilians allowed onto the island often stay longer, with military installations noting that some have been on the island facility for over 15 years. But all of this is standard operating procedure for the Diego Garcia military base. What we're seeing now.
So I often think to myself, why have I not been more successful? And the plain fact is I have not done the things that are necessary to be successful. And in particular, if I want to be successful as a live streamer and a pundit, I have to put great store in what the audience and a potential audience wants. And I have not put much store in what the audience wants. One thing the audience wants, and I have failed at, is giving them good sound. But let's get Michael back on the show. Michael, what's going on, man?
Hey, man. Speaking of failing to give the audience what it wants, here's Michael M. Vlog for an appearance.
What's on your mind today?
Well, this week I've been following the Signal chat story pretty closely, and if I understand your take, it's an example of incompetence of the Trump administration. And, you know, I could agree with that to an extent, but it's like, let's say they did this chat, they had this Signal chat, and they didn't invite Jeffrey Goldberg, we would not be talking about it, let's be honest. So I don't think the Signal aspect of this is really the story.
Okay, so it does seem like a reckless thing to conduct over Signal, some of it anyway, but I agree with you in that I don't think it's a particularly important story. But on the other hand, I don't think the thing is usually the thing. The thing is usually a symptom. And so if there's this level of incompetence with regard to having some of that conversation on Signal, my concern is that there is much wider incompetence elsewhere, that this is just a symptom. The symptom in and of itself, not necessarily that important, but the disease of which this is a symptom, that does concern me. So in and of itself, this chat, not particularly important. The disease that it is a symptom of, a disease of incompetence, does concern me.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely agree with that. However, I would diagnose the disease maybe differently than you because, again, it's crazy to me that I think the response to the scandal is pretty lame. And it is a scandal, to be honest. And, I support Trump and all that. But let's just get real. The scandal is, again, that how the hell did they invite a leftist journalist to this chat, number one? And number two, as I said, the response is so lame because they say, this guy's a loser. This guy's fake news. This guy talked about Russia collusion. Yeah, okay, I agree. So maybe don't invite him to your secret military chat about attacking Yemen.
Right. This is a stunning level of incompetence. Not just the chat, but inviting him to the chat, that he was apparently in Mike Waltz's list of contacts, that this is a lack of competence, and that concerns me. So there was one sharp observation. There are two sharp observations that are related. Mark Halperin said that if he had been invited to this chat, he would have stated right away, my name's Mark Halperin, I'm a journalist, did you mean to invite me here? And he also said that he would have left the chat right away, which is the ethical standard for lawyers, right? If a lawyer receives information that he is not supposed to, he needs to be upfront about it right away. And so Jeffrey Goldberg, by hanging out in the chat, he fell below the ethical standard for lawyers and probably the ethical standard for journalists. People may not expect that much ethics from journalists or from lawyers, but there are standards that many journalists, many lawyers live up to. But yeah, I'm just concerned about the lack of competence. And it's a symptom of another thing, that many people go to work for Donald Trump because they are blinded by their own ambition. And many people are not suited for going to work for Donald Trump. There just is a long list of people who have regretted going to work for Donald Trump. Mike Waltz was a big deal in the House of Representatives. He has had difficulty playing as a member of the team, of the Trump team. Some people are not cut out for playing as a member of a team. They need to be an individual star. Other people are not cut out for being a member of certain teams. So I am cut out to be a member of some teams. I am not cut out to be a member of other teams. Mike Waltz might simply not be cut out to be a member of the Trump team. And Elise Stefanik has also been humiliated and suffered a setback in that she signed on to be Trump's spokesperson at the United Nations. She would have been much better served by staying in the House of Representatives. So I see a lot of people blinding themselves to their own true abilities by going to work for Donald Trump when that is not aligned with their skill set.
Yeah, Mike Waltz's star qualities elude me somehow. I was not aware of him as a star in the Congress, but I'll take your word for it. I have an instinctive dislike of this guy. Everything I hear about him is bad. And I think that, again, his defense of this Signal chat scandal is ludicrous. He keeps saying, hey, haven't you ever had someone else's number in like a different contact? Hasn't that happened to you? He said that on Laura Ingraham. No, actually, that's never happened. I've never had the wrong number for the wrong person. However, I can see how you can text the wrong person like that. Yeah, I get that. I've been on the recipient end of that, at least. And maybe I've done it once, or not quite as epically as he apparently did it. So not a fan of Mike Waltz. And if you read the Signal chat, it's funny, this is in the news so much, but very little analysis of it is like, let's actually dig in. What did they actually say in this chat? So for some reason, people don't want to get into the substance of it. The Signal chat itself is highly entertaining, I guess, if you're into this kind of thing. But Mike Waltz was obviously the most kind of hawkish on that Signal chat, whereas JD Vance was the only one to raise some kind of concern about the idea, the concept of bombing the Houthis.
And I think this sheds light on a very common issue. Most people are not sufficiently scared before they send an email at work. So if you send any email at work or any written communication at work, that is beyond what is protocol, you should be scared, because so many people just blow themselves up at work by sending an inappropriate email or inviting someone to a chat that they don't belong in. And so this lack of conscientiousness and consideration for himself, and then as well for the Trump administration, again, it's a symptom of a problem, perhaps primarily with Mike Waltz, but with everyone else who participated in the chat and did not try to shut it down. They should have had the common sense to recognize that this was not a place you want to be. Like, you don't want to be a lot of places in life. So for most people, you don't want to be out publicly after midnight. Like, very few good things happen after midnight when you're out and about in the world. There are a lot of people that you want to keep distance from. There are a lot of situations that you want to keep your distance from. And if you are writing an email at work that is outside of protocol, then you should have a sense of some trepidation, a proper and appropriate amount of fear and concern, and you should double and even triple check it, because this is an incredibly common way that you'll screw up your life. I had a girlfriend who sent off a text complaining about one of her friends, but mistakenly texted the friend herself. I have another friend who's Jewish, but he sent off some commentary that was quite negative about Jews to someone who was very important in his life, who did not need to receive that commentary, like sent it off by mistake. So it's a signal to me of a lack of competence, a lack of consideration, a lack of conscientiousness by primarily Mike Waltz, but also everyone else in the chat. Back to you.
Yeah, exactly. But getting back to the chat itself, as I said, J.D. Vance was saying, I'm not sure that this is our responsibility to keep this particular body of water open to commerce, that this should fall to Europe because, 30% of the commerce is from Europe and only 7%. And Mike Waltz came out of the gate so hard to say, that's actually not true. It does affect us. And per the president, this is what. So it was like really off-putting the way that he had this kind of appeal to the boss, but also a very overbearing manner in his interaction with J.D. Vance. That tells me that it kind of makes it look like he's trying to move the administration in a certain direction, which is a little more of like a neocon direction, as was the case in Trump's first term. That was a big problem. And here's Mike Waltz to do this thing. He's like H.R. McMaster. That was Trump's national security advisor in his first term, who was always trying to spin whatever President Trump said. Actually, like, Trump wants to keep doing the same disastrous foreign policy that we would have done anyway if we didn't have Trump.
Right. So I worked as a temp in various offices between 1995 and 1997. At the same time, I was working on my first book, A History of X, 100 Years of Sex in Film. And one day when I was working at an insurance company, I sent off a fax to the Los Angeles Times notifying them about an HIV outbreak in the San Fernando Valley pornography industry and how it was likely related to unprotected anal sex. And I didn't realize that when you send a fax, that a copy of the fax gets printed out. And so as I'm working at the front desk, I noticed people in an office far away kind of gathering and snickering. And then this Jewish woman comes over and hands me a copy of my fax without saying anything. And I was just absolutely mortified, absolutely humiliated. Another time, I was called in on a Saturday night to work at an overtime rate, and I was working on my book, and I couldn't get it off the screen fast enough, and so I got fired from that job as well. I have been humiliated so many times, and I hate being humiliated. And my friends, I usually let them know I don't want to talk about these humiliations. It's just too traumatic, too painful. There's only a tiny number of people with whom I'll talk about these painful humiliations. And Mike Waltz got humiliated like I got humiliated because I lost touch with reality, I had a grandiose sense of self that this was a-okay to do because my writing and my research and my reporting was so important. And so I consistently note when I lose touch with reality and have an exaggerated sense of my own importance, I will get humiliated. Mike Waltz has an exaggerated sense of his own importance that he built up from his time in Congress. And now he's been dressed down by Pete Hegseth and by J.D. Vance for being overbearing with his own opinions. This showed up in the chat in the way that you described. And so it's true for Mike Waltz, it's true for me, it's true for you. I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing, but there are weeks and months of my life where I navigate reality without this type of humiliation. But then as soon as I get an exaggerated sense of my own importance, it's inevitable that I'm about to suffer another humiliation. And Mike Waltz has suffered a humiliation because he had an exaggerated sense of his own importance. Over to you.
Wow. Yeah, the facts thing, that is quite a story, and we can all relate to that. That's kind of like a 1990s tech version of hitting a reply all at the wrong time. And yeah, like I've definitely done that once or twice. Like similar to a reply all where you didn't want to reply all, or just mixing personal stuff that shouldn't be there. Like, but I'm very conscientious about that. After having experienced that, like you don't let that happen twice. So, but final thought. I think I'm going to pick up the Michael Wolff book you were discussing, or the book Revenge, one of the two. I was at Barnes and Noble yesterday, and I saw the Mike Wolff book, and I've read a couple books by Mike Wolff. I read Fire and Fury, and then I read another one. I forget the title, unfortunately, but it was about, he talks about Tucker in it a lot. It was from a few years ago. So I think Mike Wolff is a good writer. I think he has a good writing style, even more so. Although he's accused of being fake news all the time, but I think I'm willing to read his book. So I'm going to sign off, but
Okay, bro.
hopefully in like 2 weeks, I'll be ready to discuss that book for you and
Sounds
for
good.
your audience.
Okay, man.
Thanks,
Take care,
40.
bro. Okay, bye-bye. So if you're going to just choose one book between Michael Wolff's book on Trump's comeback victory and the book by Axios reporter Alex Eisenstadt, then I would recommend the one by Alex Eisenstadt. It seems more factual. I get a sense of just more diligence, more conscientiousness, more consideration for truth. And it strikes me as equally well written as Michael Wolff's book. Michael Wolff's book swings for the fences more, right? He's going for grander pronouncements. Alex feels as though he is going to limit his rhetorical flamboyance to that which he can fastidiously document as true. And so I enjoy Michael Wolff. I read Michael Wolff, but I think Alex Eisenstadt is a superior book. One other thought occurred to me. This has been another source of my humiliation in the workplace, and that is I use company Wi-Fi. And then when I was outside of the company, but unbeknownst to me, my phone was still pulling in company Wi-Fi. I was checking my social media, and that was recorded, and it led to humiliation. So I strongly urge you, do not use the Wi-Fi where you work, right? You don't know when you might inadvertently check something on your phone or just reveal something about your phone use. Even when you're outside of the office, right? The corporate Wi-Fi might be pulling in your phone when you're 50 yards outside the office. And that can be most humiliating. I don't recommend it. Oy vey. So I don't care about the Signal story in and of itself. And Mark Halperin often talks about, he was at the Green Bay Diner, and he's speaking metaphorically here, and all anyone could talk about is this or that abstruse issue that is occupying Washington. So I don't think people in the real world care much about the Signal chat. I don't think there is a reason in and of itself to care much about the Signal chat. But the damage control operation that the Trump administration mounted kept the story on the front pages. I thought it was pathetic. I thought it showed bad character. I found it embarrassing as someone who's generally aligned with Donald Trump. I mean, if you're caught doing the wrong thing, then own it. Now, I find it tiring to make decisions, so I try to live as much of my life as possible by protocols. Because when there are protocols, I just act more automatically. And one way I've reduced choice in my life is about 2 weeks ago, I stopped giving myself a choice about using my CPAP. So I was using this heavily elevated wedge so that my head was about an inch, about a foot above my waist to reduce my sleep apnea. But that was only mildly useful, if at all useful. I may have been deluding myself about how useful it was. And I was just regularly just getting ticked off with my CPAP. I'd leave it on for a few minutes to open up my nasal passages, and I'd take it off. And I was prescribed a CPAP, I think, about 2010, so for about 15 years. But I would say of my sleep time over the past 15 years, I'm afraid maybe only 10% on average of my sleep time have I left my CPAP on. And then about 2 weeks ago, I made the decision, all right, this is no longer a choice. You are just leaving your CPAP on. And when it was no longer a choice, I stopped fighting it. Within a day or two, I learned to stop hating my CPAP, start loving my CPAP. And as a result, I have consistently had the best sleep that I can remember in years because I stopped giving myself a choice. And I'm just a completely different person when I'm sleeping. So prior to these 2 weeks, I was sleepy almost all the time during the day and just fatigue, lacking energy. So thank God I relapsed and relaxed and stopped making choices about my CPAP and just put it on, use it as a protocol. So speaking of truth and failure, right, when I hear people talking about trying harder, right, I recognize that people are engaged in a losing proposition. Trying harder really has helped me succeed in life for very long. Exerting more willpower, also a losing formula, right? More self-control, also a losing formula. I mean, it's helped at times. I remember in 7th grade, I twice told my teacher to shut up. And I think I told her to shut up because she was so beautiful, it made me uncomfortable. And she was so beautiful that when she touched me, I would shudder because my dad would shudder when he was touched by women. But she was just so beautiful and classy. And so, of course, I told her to shut up. And after I did that a second time, the next morning, she said, I think you should be homeschooled. And I did not want that. I did not want that. I liked my classmates. I loved my teacher. And I was able to exert enough self-control to not do that again. So at times, self-control has served me. I remember to preserve certain relationships, I didn't write anything at all about the relationship or anything I learned in the course of the relationship. And so I have exerted self-control in ways that have served me. But overall, exerting self-control is not a winning formula. I've learned that from my own failures.
Now is much different. TWC says that a combination of radio chatter and satellite imagery confirms that the US is sending B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia. The first signs came on March 25, with satellite imagery demonstrating that at least 3 C-17 cargo planes had made their way to the island, alongside 10 aerial refueling tankers. Both are important to any future B-2 bombing runs, given that the island is about 1,000 miles away from the next nearest landmass. The refueling tankers will play key roles in keeping America's B-2s airborne for any strike missions conducted against Iran. As for the cargo planes, they're doing exactly what the name suggests, shipping vital cargo to Diego Garcia.
So 2 of the most intelligent people who listen to my show have given me similar feedback. right? And they note there's often a significant volume differential between some of the clips you play and your own voice. So my voice tends to start out strong, and then it drops in volume as I become tired during the show. So here's the feedback. It's hard to modulate. I don't know if there's anything you can do or system checks you might have to help equalize this. It's not constant, but it's fairly regular. So Art Bell's noted this. Kamadov has noticed this. And one thing I've done with my podcast, with my MP3s, is that I run it through MP3 cut and I boost the volume 50%. And so when I was having significant sound problems in the past, I solved them with a $500 audio consultation with someone who is an audio expert. And I learned to make most of my modulation settings on the hardware rather than using Streamlabs software. But today I am boosting the gain on my Streamlabs to like 24. So when I boost the gain on my Streamlabs, that boosts the gain both for my own voice and for the clips that I play. So I'm going to try to pay more attention to looking at my Streamlabs. So right now my sound quality seems good. It's bothered me in the past. I don't listen back to my own show as much as I should. So if I was serious about being excellent at this, if I was serious about being successful, I would watch a lot more of my shows. But one thing that has bothered me when I have watched my shows is my sound peaking, right? That would really bother me, the clipping and the peaking. And so I've been erring on the side of understating my sound. And also because I'm such a sadic, because I'm such a righteous man, like I deliberately turn down my charisma so that I don't develop a parasocial following among my listeners. I deliberately turn down just the raw charismatic power of my personality so that I don't overwhelm the viewer. And as part of this mission of humility, self-abnegation, Lord, make me a doormat for other people to walk over, I have subdued my own volume. Now, I thought I was doing the righteous thing, but I was showing a lack of consideration for the listener. Right? I was showing a lack of conscientiousness, right? I was causing them annoyance, even pain and suffering. And so I stand before you and I'm going to do better. I really want to have more even sound quality. I don't want to be peaking, right? I don't want to be peaking all up in your ear, and I don't want you to have to strain. I just don't want there to be this big volume differential between the clips I play and the words that I say. And so right now I'm just looking at my volume. Now, on the other hand, right, this takes mental resources that I would otherwise be using to deploy insights into reality that might forever change your life. So when I start a show, the possibilities for my show just seem enormous, right? I feel like I'm going to ski through this vista and this meadow and take on this topic, and I'm just going to come up with some brilliant observations on this news item, and I'm going to engage in this comedic riff. And then the cognitive resources required to operate a live stream start tightening me up, and all the possibilities in my life just seem to narrow. So the more prep I do, obviously, the better show I will usually deliver. And Elliot says, have you tried smarter, right? Instead of trying harder, try smarter. And that's a good challenge because I often like turning off my brain and just doing things on automatic so that I can save my brain power for the things that I really want to use my brain power on. But that has often resulted in quite substandard work. And so I worked at K-High Cahill Radio News between 1985 and 1988. And I remember boasting to the radio news director, Pete Dufour, that I was working 60 hours plus a week in landscaping, and I was taking these units in college, and I was doing all this, and he had a great comeback. He said, yes, but are they quality hours? And that stung, because I'd come back from Australia where I was earning about $25 an hour American and working landscaping in California, where most of the jobs are taken by Latino immigrants, often illegal immigrants, and I was getting paid $4 an hour. Right, I went from 25 to 4, and so I was trying to make up for it with volume, but turning in a lot of shoddy work. Right, I was too lazy to get out of the truck, and so the truck bumper caught a steel door and ripped it and broke it. And that cost me, I don't know, a couple of $100 because of my own callousness.
West wants, mainly the United States, is a general ceasefire, sort of an overarching ceasefire, and then we'll move to talking about a real peace agreement. What the Russians want is they want to get a real peace agreement on the table, and they want everybody to agree on that.
So when you're talking about a deal, right, it helps to know who holds the cards. For example, in relations between employers and employees, employers almost invariably hold more cards, have more power than employees. There's a brief period, right, in 2021, maybe even stretching into 2022, where employees seem to have an unusual amount of pull with regard to their employers, but that was probably overstated, right? Most of the time, your employer holds more cards than you do, and often you can be doing a great job at your work, but you have created a liability for your employer and you will be fired. And often we are far more replaceable than we would like to think. And so with regard to the Ukraine war, Putin and Russia hold the cards. And so if there's going to be a ceasefire, if there's going to be peace, it is going to be on Russia's terms. And I'm all for that. I am for settling this any way that it takes, even if it's on Putin's terms. Just settling this war significantly reduces the chances of nuclear war or a direct conflict between the United States and Russia. Let's settle the damn thing. But to settle it, we have to recognize Putin holds the cards. We do not hold the cards.
Peace agreement. And then there'll be a ceasefire. So at the most general level, you have a fundamental disagreement between the two sides. However, what's happened here is we've opened discussions on a ceasefire or a pair of ceasefires. But it's very important to emphasize that this is not a general ceasefire. The Russians have no interest in a general ceasefire, as I said, at this point in time. So you get these two ceasefires on not terribly meaningful issues. One is you restore the Black Sea agreement, and two, you have this agreement on striking energy facilities. And they're limited agreements, and I can't tell whether they're in effect. It's not clear who's agreed to exactly what. It's not agreed to as exactly when they started and whether they have started. And again, they're not on the major issues. This is not an overarching ceasefire. And furthermore, the Russians are not interested in an overarching ceasefire for smart reasons. They'd be crazy to agree to a ceasefire of a general sort because they're on the march. And they want to deal with the big issues on the table, which are, whether Ukraine is in NATO, what territory the Ukrainians are going to give up, and how much disarmament is going to take place inside of Ukraine. Those are the.
And there's a question in the chat. You should participate in an overnight sleep study. I participated in an overnight sleep study. I know I have sleep apnea. I know my life is better when I leave the damn CPAP on, but I have allowed myself a choice and to just get ticked off with it. My father, for example, had poor sleep, it seems, his entire adult life. And people kept telling him, get tested for sleep apnea. And he would always reject the advice. He's saying, look, I'm skinny. Sleep apnea is something that obese people suffer from. When my father finally got tested for sleep apnea when he was about 85, all right, it turned out he had severe life-threatening sleep apnea. But my father could not accept using a CPAP because that would mean accepting that he'd been wrong about something that had devastated the quality of his life. So my father would rather die than admit he was wrong, right? It was so painful. And that's not so much a conscious choice of my father. You have to understand the chaotic childhood that my father came from. My father had a mother who was a sex and love addict who was chasing men up and down the east coast of Australia. She was a terrible mother. He had an absent father. And so my father reacted to the chaos in his upbringing like I reacted to the reduced level of chaos in my upbringing by becoming overly strict and overly inflexible in relations with others. And one way of maintaining a sense of self in a chaotic, frightening world is to have absolute assurance in your own correctness. And so my poor father, he was victimized by his coping mechanisms for the chaos of his childhood. He could not admit being wrong. So he would rather die than allow himself to use a CPAP, because the pain of recognizing how much devastation was wreaked in his life by his unwillingness to get tested for sleep apnea and then to use a CPAP, it was just too much. It was similar to the overwhelming levels of pain that I suffered when I got into various 12-step programs, and I recognized how much my sex addiction or my love addiction or my codependency or my debting or my under-earning, how much damage that had done to my life. And for weeks after I'd done a thorough first step, second step, third step, fourth step, and for weeks after I had surveyed the wreckage of my life as a result of my self-defeating compulsions, it was painful. I just walked around sobered. It was hard to accept. Or when I started taking beef organ capsules about 4 years ago and all my health problems went away, and to accept the tremendous pain that my life had been crippled by my vegetarian diet, and I only got around to doing something about it when I was 54 or 55. It was like a tsunami level of pain. And it takes a few weeks to quote unquote process that, and I don't think my father could stand that level of pain, recognizing all the devastation done to his life. So when I did the overnight sleep study, it showed that I had mild sleep apnea when I slept on my side and moderate sleep apnea when I slept on my back. Most people will tend to sleep on their left side 80% of the time. I think that's certainly true for me. Whew. And it's really hard to get recovery without a good night's sleep, right? It's really hard to significantly improve the quality of your life without a good night's sleep. And for tens of millions of Americans, the single easiest, most substantial thing they can do to improve the quality of their health and their vitality in their life is to get a good night's sleep. If you snore, you have sleep apnea. No ifs, ands, ors, or buts about it. If you snore, snoring is sleep apnea. It is a symptom of sleep apnea. So the chat says, my brother-in-law was stopping breathing like every other breath. He was always tired. His brother died most likely from sleep apnea. And the great NFL defensive lineman and preacher man, Reggie White, who had such a profound influence on my own worldview when he recognized that different people have different gifts, he died of sleep apnea. So if you're tired, you're fatigued, right? Do what you need to do to get a good night's sleep. And that likely will mean addressing your sleep apnea.
The core issues the Russians understandably care about. And as best I can tell from the outside, we've made no progress on those issues, which are the key issues. Instead, we're futzing around with these small ceasefires and not even making much progress there. Let me make one final point before I turn it over to Alexander. It's very clear from just watching these ceasefire negotiations play out that the Ukrainians are going to do everything they can to undermine any kind of US-Russian agreement. And this does not portend well for the future.
I agree.
So I asked Grok, was the United States well served by entering World War I? And Grok said it's not clear. So the case for the United States staying out of World War I is a substantial case, right? The case for America withdrawing more from the world, withdrawing from the role of the world's policeman, is a strong case. I asked Grok, did the United States provoke Japan into its Pearl Harbor attack? And again, Grok said there is strong evidence in that direction. So it's not like the United States was just sitting on its hands prior to Japan's attack, right? The United States created conditions whereby Japan was either going to have to abjectly surrender to American demands, or Japan was going to carry out an attack on the United States. And so too with Ukraine. Ukraine was not just sitting around studying Ukrainian poetry. Ukraine had positioned itself as a de facto member of NATO, thereby allying itself as with the enemy of Russia. Now, in the West, if you're an American or in Western Europe or Central Europe, you may think of NATO as the good guys. You may think of NATO as not a threat to Russia, but how you understand reality is not the end of the story. How Russia understands reality is important, and Russia understands NATO as a threat to Russia. And when Ukraine, on a de facto basis, allied with NATO, it strongly incentivized Russia to smash and destroy it. And I think the same applies to our lives. If we ally with the enemies of people who are important to us, they'll be strongly incentivized to smash us and to destroy us if we make ourselves a liability for the most high-minded of reasons, right? We will incentivize other people to smash us. If people hurt us, it's highly likely that we did something to provoke them, right? If you have people in your life, you'll inevitably step on other people's toes and they will retaliate. And when people retaliate, they won't usually retaliate proportionately. Instead, there is a finely tuned evolutionary instinct to lash back at people where it hurts the most, right? I have consistently found that when I anger people, they just zero in on my weaknesses. So when I was trying to complete my conversion to Judaism, right, and I was highly insecure about that, people would pick up on it and they would zero in on it to hurt me. When it was clear that Dennis Prager was my hero, people would zero in on that and they'd say things to Dennis Prager about me because they recognized that that would cause me a tremendous amount of pain. So even people of average intelligence or even below average intelligence, they have a finely tuned ability to zero in on what will hurt you. Right? People are really good at figuring out your weak points, and I've often shored up certain weak points that people would traditionally attack, and I always found that people just stopped attacking me there. I didn't even have to go to any great effort. Somehow the word got out that this was no longer a weak point, and people no longer attacked me on that weak point. So when I would give off the vibe that I was frightened, that I was anxious, right, people would pick on me. Right, people would pick that up and they would bully me. When I would work through that issue, so I was no longer putting out the vibe of fear and anxiety, then people just stopped doing it. And I didn't need to announce anything. The word just somehow got out. So people know our weaknesses. And there may have been a profound Ukrainian-related reason why I said that, but doggone it, I can't remember. But at least I'm being honest, right? Just like a dog humping your leg, right? A dog humping your leg, he is also being honest.
Compromises, it would be one thing, but without a political settlement and the assumption that this would just start up again in the future, wouldn't they need the territory to have more territory as an insurance guarantee in case conflicts will start up again? And new administration comes into the U.S., the Europeans decide that they will, want to prop up Ukraine. It's very hard. I don't know. There's a lot of optimism around the negotiations. I see a bit of a shadow falling over it at the moment.
I think the fundamental problem here is that there are only a handful of people in the West who understand the essence of this conflict. We are 3 of those people, but there are not that many of us. And we have been marginalized, which is very important.
And me too. I too have been marginalized. I too understand. I too am among that tiny group of people who know, right? I too am a member of the elect. I too am going to go to heaven to live with the Lord.
To understand that. And the people who operate in the mainstream, both in the media and in the policy world, have a very different picture in their head of what's going on and what can be achieved. And I think that collectively, we think that these people are delusional, that they just don't understand the nature of the conflict. And the fact is, the Russians are winning on the battlefield, and the Russians have made a series of demands that are non-negotiable. You can debate about how much territory they're going to give up, but they're going to keep those 4 oblasts plus Crimea, and they're probably going to even want some more territory. These are non-negotiable demands. The same goes with regard to disarming Ukraine to the point where it's not an offensive threat to Russia. And the same goes with security.
Have I ever praised the New York Times? All right, a lot of valuable reporting in the New York Times, including on this issue. It's the #1 story for the past few hours on the New York Times homepage, headlined "The Secret History of the War in Ukraine." So Ukraine has been operating pretty much like a de facto member of NATO ever since Russia's invasion, as well as the years prior to the invasion. Not fully a member of NATO in that NATO countries are not explicitly waging war on Ukraine's behalf with their own forces, but they are providing intelligence and weapons. So every day that NATO fights Russia on a de facto basis in Ukraine, we run a dramatically higher risk of nuclear war with Russia and the end of life on Earth as we know it. This is a bad idea. We need to shut down this war as soon as possible. You may be interested in Annie Jacobson's book, Nuclear War, A Scenario. Right? Tell me if you read that you want to risk this. Right? On the other hand, the survival, the prosperity, and the size of Ukraine and the freedom of Ukraine to set its own foreign policy as an independent nation state has zero effect on America's freedom and prosperity and strength. And the same may be true for Israel as well. So on the one hand, we have nothing to gain by being so deeply embedded in the war in Ukraine. And on the other hand, we've got so much to lose. And this New York Times article shows the dramatic amount of assistance that America has rendered Ukraine, helping it to slaughter hundreds of thousands of Russians. Right? The U.S. is on the verge of going to war with Iran, in part because Iran is the mothership for all sorts of terrorism around the world, and in part because Iran assisted in the slaughter of hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans in Iraq. Right? Americans resent Iran's role in the killing of Americans in Iraq. Why would Russia not resent America for similar reasons to why America resents Iran? Right? We have participated and assisted and enabled the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Russians. Right? Why would Russia not want to find our weak points and retaliate? So side by side in a German mission command center in Wiesbaden, American and Ukrainian officers plan Kiev's counter-offensive. Vast American intelligence collection effort guided big-picture battle strategy and funneled precise targeting information down to Ukrainian soldiers in the field. Right? One European intelligence chief was taken aback when he learned how deeply enmeshed his NATO counterparts had become in Ukrainian operations. Right? They are part of the kill chain, he said. You don't think there's going to be a price for that? Right? Russia is massively incentivized to hurt the West and to hurt the United States because of how much we have hurt Russia. So the West thought, wow, this close cooperation, this will allow the Ukrainians to hurt the Russians, right? By funding Ukraine, we are bleeding Russia. And so in the early parts of the war, in strike after successful strike, right, Ukrainian bravery and dexterity, Russian incompetence, and Western intelligence and weaponry, right, helped slaughter hundreds of thousands of Russians. Now, the partnership between the West and Ukraine was strained. Ukrainians saw the Americans as overbearing and controlling, the prototypically patronizing Americans, and the Americans couldn't understand why the Ukrainians didn't accept good advice. The Americans wanted to focus on measurable, achievable objectives, and they saw the Ukrainians as constantly grasping for a big win, the bright, shiny prize that would elude them. The Ukrainians saw the Americans as holding them back. The Ukrainians aimed to win the war outright. The Americans didn't think that was possible. The Americans were right. So even if you don't like Americans, even if you find them patronizing and overbearing, right, there are all sorts of people in our lives who are patronizing, overbearing, obnoxious, cruel, nasty, just horrible in the way they speak to us. But if they're telling us the truth, right, we need to accept the truth, and the Americans were right. Ukraine's major counter-offensive was in the summer of 2023. It was just an absolute disaster, just complete idiocy. So let's go back to a key paragraph here in the New York Times. The partnership operated in the shadow of deepest geopolitical fear. The Vladimir Putin might see it as breaching a red line in military engagement. and Putin might make good on his often brandished nuclear threats. The story of the partnership between America and Ukraine shows how close the Americans and their allies came to that red line, right? How close we got to a nuclear war is crazy. It's only because Russia has been successful, right? The more successful Russia is, right, the more likely it is that Ukraine will make a deal, and the less likely it is that Russia will use nuclear weapons, right? If Ukraine had succeeded with their counteroffensive, right, Russia may well have used nuclear weapons. So we came incredibly close to that nuclear red line. All right, what a disaster that would have been. And then the Times says increasingly dire events, meaning Ukraine getting hurt, force them to advance to more perilous ground, and how they carefully devise protocols to remain on the safe side of not having a nuclear war. Oh, thank God. Thank God the Biden administration had protocols. Guys, where would we be if the Biden administration didn't have protocols so that we would remain on the safe side of this fight? Right? Protocols are great as much as possible. I try to live my life by protocols, but don't put too much faith in protocols, right? Protocols are not the magic key to reality. I love protocols, but protocols don't foreclose the possibility of a nuclear war, right? We got way too close to a nuclear war, and I don't have disproportionate faith in protocols, right? Surgeons use protocols, right? Hospitals use protocols. Airline pilots use protocols. Journalists should use protocols. Protocols are great. Protocols are usually far better than winging it, but let's not impute to protocols heavier burdens than they can bear. Oh, thank God we had the protocols, guys. We had the learned protocols of the elders of the Biden administration. Thank God for those protocols. Just imagine where we'd be if we didn't have those super slick protocols. Thank God.
You want to remember that inside the Trump administration, there are a lot of neoconservatives, a lot of super hawks. And what I believe Trump has done is he's brought in Steve Witkoff because he doesn't trust people like Marco Rubio and Mike Vance. He knows he needs them for certain political reasons, but he doesn't trust them. So who is his main negotiator on Russia? It's Witkoff. Who is his main negotiator on the Middle East? It's Witkoff. So you bring in this guy who is very smart, and he's a great negotiator in the context of the real estate world in New York City. But as we all know, you have to know these cases like the back of your hand if you're going to be the lead negotiator, right? You have to know the Ukraine case and the Israel case backwards and forwards. And Steve Witkoff doesn't know hardly anything. He's not.
So expertise is not always the magic key to reality, but there are many times in life where possessing expertise does give you a significant advantage. And when you don't have expertise, you're going to blunder around. And this is John Mearsheimer making the case for the importance of expertise. And everything that Mearsheimer says in this conversation on the Duran, I agree with.
Spent his life studying these issues. And again, not only is he dealing with the Ukraine issue, he's dealing with the Middle East issue as well. And that one's as thorny, maybe even thornier than the Ukraine issue. So he's pulled in two different directions. And furthermore, Trump and Witkoff are surrounded by people who fundamentally disagree on what Trump and Witkoff are doing. You know, going back to this phone call that the conversation that took place on Signal, it's no accident that Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, had Jeff Goldberg on his list of phone numbers and accidentally plugged him into the conversation, because Jeff Goldberg is a super hawk on Ukraine and on the Middle East. And Waltz is a super hawk on Ukraine and the Middle East. And I'm sure that Waltz has talked to Goldberg before, right? And this is what Trump is up against. This is the problem Trump had the first time around from 2017 to 2021. He has said this on many occasions, and he's not going to let it happen again. But he brought these people into the administration who think about the.
I've got a confession to make. I've often had the fantasy that I'd get hired on by the Daily Wire, because I'd read these articles about what a successful operation this was. And so I wouldn't think about the limitations on my freedom. I just thought about, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could just be a full-time commentator on the news? I've got so much wisdom to share with the world. I'd get a wider audience. I'd be part of a team. Wouldn't that be awesome? And now Daily Wire seems to be heading for bankruptcy. They're laying off staff. And the attempt to make a living by the pen or by your live streaming commentary is rather a perilous one. Kip says, I'm not sure what success looks like in live streaming, but in finance, it required developing and following a series of patterns or protocols, which, when done in concert, bred success. So I think probably the same thing in live streaming, but I just asked Rock, what are the keys to success in live streaming and podcasting commentary on the news? So apparently success hinges on a mixture of practical, creative, and audience-focused elements. So I'm not so strong on the practical. I'm okay on the creative, and I'm really weak on the audience-focused elements. So consistency is critical. Regular scheduling builds audience habits. Pick a cadence you can stick to. Erratic posting kills momentum. All right, guilty. Look at someone like Tim Pool. His near daily streams keep viewers hooked because they know when to tune in. Please God, if success looks like Tim Pool, I don't want to be successful. If loving Asian women is wrong, I don't want to be right. Content quality over polish, right? I'm doing good here. You don't need a fancy studio, but you do need clear audio. People will forgive bad video because they tolerate muffled sound. Invest in a decent mic, a Shure SM7B. I've got that, all right? I've got a decent mic. Focus on what you are saying. Offer a fresh angle. Do not just parrot headlines, right? Don't just play other people's clips. Dig into primary sources like court filings or press releases and break them down. People crave insight, not regurgitation. So that is a good point. I am sorry that I have regurgitated all over you too often and too much. I'm sorry, that was wrong. Third, engagement. Live streaming thrives on real-time interaction. Read the chat, answer questions, riff off comments. So I've been experiencing some lower back tension of late, and it comes from riding my stationary bike, and I know what I'm doing wrong. If I lean forward while riding my stationary bike, I get off the bike feeling crippled. So I need to stop leaning forward, need to stop resting my hands on the handlebars so I can get the readout on what's going on with my pulse. I just need to sit up and not lean forward, because when I lean forward, it's just killing my lower back. Reply to listener emails and social media. That keeps it alive. Make your audience feel heard. Do you feel heard? Is this a safe space? Joe Rogan's best episodes come from him reacting to what his guests or fans throw at him. If success looks like Joe Rogan, please, I do not want to be successful. What's more important for men? Emotional safety or accountability? So I think men, it's more important that we have accountability, and probably for women, their deepest need is for emotional safety. So RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, he was reprimanded on my newsfeed in Axios for body shaming the obese governor of West Virginia with his Make America Healthy campaign. So body shaming just sounds so unmasculine, right? Men, I think, thrive on accountability, even if that accountability is some stranger yelling, hey, fatso. Right? We need accountability more than emotional safety, but I also want this to be an emotionally safe place for you. But primarily, I'm here to provide accountability. Right? Authenticity. Pick your lane. Politics, tech, lean into your perspective. Don't fake it. People smell inauthenticity a mile away. So on a 1 to 10, with 0 being totally inauthentic and 10 being authentic, how would you score me? Phil DeFranco's snarky but informed style works because it's him, not a persona. I use a persona. I'm a country Australia dude just off the boat in America. I've only lived in California for 47 years, but it's just such a useful persona. It just seems to make life easier. I can just tell the liberal city slickers with genuine book learning that, hey, I'm just off the boat from outback Australia. I'm imprisoned in my outdated gender norms. Help me become the wokester that I know I can be, right? People enjoy that. Discoverability. Titles and thumbnails matter. Trump's latest move will shock you, beat News Update 47. Share clips with punchy takes. 30 seconds of your hottest opinion can pull people in. Yeah, I notice sometimes on the rare occasion that I publish a short that gets, say, more than 10,000 views, I'll also get 100 plus subscribers. SEO helps. Use specific keywords like 2025 election analysis over vague terms. Finally, endurance. Growth takes time. Yeah, I've only been live streaming on an almost daily basis since the beginning of 2018. Most successful creators, say Destiny or Hassan Piker, grinded for years before blowing up. Analytics are your friend. Check what works, retention spikes, view counts, and double down. Okay, so let me score myself on a 1 to 10. Consistency, I'm not great there. I give myself a 5 out of 10. Content quality over polish, I would give myself a 5 out of 10. Engagement, I would give myself a 7 out of 10. Authenticity, I'd give myself a 7 out of 10. Discoverability, I'd give myself a 0 out of 10. Endurance, I'd give myself a 10 out of 10. So there you go, mate.
The Ukraine crisis differently than he does. So we basically have a situation here. You have Steve Witkoff, who just doesn't know a lot, doesn't have a lot of experience in these kinds of negotiations, is pulled in two different directions, and is surrounded by people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, who are super hawks on Ukraine. And it's hardly surprising that the Trump administration is getting nowhere on trying to solve the Ukraine war.
So what is the plan B then? Because if Trump can't negotiate an end to the war, does he turn on anyone? Does he turn against the Russians?
Is to recognize that at the moment he can't do much because he doesn't have the coercive leverage over the Ukrainians or the Europeans, or even over a lot of people in his administration. But you wait a while and see what happens on the battlefield. And if the Russians are very successful this spring and this summer and this fall, which I think is likely, it's very hard to tell what exactly they're going to do and how many forces they've built up and so forth and so on. But I think a good case can be made that the Russians will soon be back on the march, and the Ukrainian defenses will continue to crumble. That's point one. Point two is there are a lot of weapons and a lot of money in the pipeline, but that pipeline is not forever. That's the Biden pipeline. And Trump is not going to go back to Congress. The votes are not there in Congress to sort of put more material and more money in the pipeline. So you send a message to the Ukrainians. You say, I'll let you have the stuff that Biden promised you, but when that runs out, it's all over with. And then the third thing is you let the Europeans continue to squabble among themselves, which is already happening. And you're not dealing any longer with a united Europe. And if you're Trump, you find those European countries that are willing to play ball with you. And you work out deals with them to try and fracture the Europeans. And at the same time, you tell the Ukrainians, look.
So Elliot Blatt says, I stopped drinking coffee. It was hard, but now my mind is much clearer. Therefore, I'm able to work more efficiently. Caffeine is amazing, right? It's like porn. I mean, it just really hits you in a visceral way. But like porn, right, what starts out as adaptive, from what I understand, very quickly becomes maladaptive. I listened to an Audible book on a history of caffeine. So apparently coffee houses became a big deal in, I think, the 17th century. And Michael Pollan, I think he wrote the book on history of caffeine. And he says that caffeine and coffee, these were uppers and stimulants. And so he says that in part we got the Enlightenment because of caffeine and coffee, while people hanging out in bars are consuming primarily alcohol, which is the opposite of a stimulant. It's a depressive. So I found that interesting perspective.
The Europeans are not going to pull your chestnuts out of the fire. Congress is not going to give you any more money and any more weaponry. And the Russians are on the march. Have you noticed that you're losing more territory? And you're going to lose more territory if you don't settle. And I want to cut a deal now. So let's cut the deal now. I think that's the best hope for Trump, just to let events play out. and in a perverse kind of way, hope they play out to Russia's advantage, because that will give you coercive leverage over both the Ukrainians and the Europeans. But if that doesn't work, the war just goes on, and the Russians will take more and more territory, and they'll be more ruthless over time in terms of dealing with the Ukrainians, because they'll want to shut this war down.
So, well, America has some leverage then over the, well, Ukrainians and the Europeans. As you said, you can cut off the weapons, which would, I guess, escalate the
targets, government targets, go after the bridges, go after other targets that he's left alone up to now, all for the purposes of delivering a hammer blow at this crucial moment. Or am I exaggerating here?
I think that is absolutely the case. I mean, Putin even acknowledged it to some extent again in his speech yesterday when he said that, you know, the Russians have been moving forward, but in the way that they could be. So I think those pressures are absolutely there. I think that one of the factors that is never understood in the West is that Putin himself is a very cautious man and a moderate in Russian terms. He is not the kind of aggressive, megalomaniac imperialist that he's represented. Far from it. Perhaps there are some people in Russia who are like that, but not him. And his ability to maintain a kind of discipline on the political system has been remarkable, and a sign of the political capital that he's been able to build up over the 25 years that he's been Russia's leader. But that political capital is not inexhaustible. And one of the things that you immediately sensed the moment the negotiations, the discussions with the Americans began, was that there was this wave of tension. Is he going to give it away? Is he going to give us another Minsk III? And there was this sense of relief after he spoke with Trump on the 18th of March, and it became clear that, on the contrary, he was going to stick to the positions. So Putin's political maneuver space is nowhere near as big as I think some people suppose, and certainly that criticism is there.
If you look at how Putin has waged the war since February 24th, 2022, and then you think about how the Americans or the Israelis would have waged the same war. In other words, if the Americans or the Israelis had been in Moscow running this war, we would have been much.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're talking about our greatest ally here, Mr. Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer. So have you had anyone in your life, family, acquaintance, friend, mentor, boss, who would often tantalize you with all sorts of ways that they are going to help you out, but they never follow through? So in my life experience, right, I probably heard 5 to 10 times more people promising to help me out than actually help me out. And there was one person who did that, talked a lot, but never followed through. But he did give me some important advice, and that was clean here so that you can shine over there, right? Polish here so that you can shine here. And I just did that, right? I walked away from this live stream and I just did a little cleaning, and now you're going to see me shining because I just did a little cleaning.
Much more ruthless than Putin. And the Israelis, I mean, I don't even want to think about what they would have done to the Ukrainians. They were in charge. So it's really quite amazing to me that Putin has this reputation in the West of being the second coming of Adolf Hitler, this ruthless and highly aggressive dictator who's bent on murdering as many civilians as possible. And if we can just get rid of him and get somebody else in there, things will be much better. I think this is simply wrong. I mean, anytime a country wages war, it's a horrible thing and lots of people get killed. But the Russians have been remarkably restrained, at least to me, given my study of war over a long period of time. The Russians have not been especially aggressive or barbaric.
Right, that's not a perspective that you get from the ruling class and the elite media. But I think he's right there. Kip says, success, much like leaving a legacy, might be overrated because in many cases it's fleeting, or it creates boundaries that one isn't comfortable navigating. People want what they don't have, bro. Yes, well, everything's fleeting. So in the long run, we're all dead, right? In the long run, you know, almost all the things that we thought would really matter don't tend to matter very much.
Given how many other militaries have behaved in the past. And I have long argued that it is likely, if you get rid of Putin, that whoever replaces him will be more aggressive not less aggressive. But this is an argument that is hard to sell in the West.
Well, it's one of the problems, I think, in the West. Whenever we go to war, we always go to war against the leader. We always go, we go against, we don't say we go to war against Yugoslavia, we go against Milosevic, we go against Saddam Hussein, we go against Putin. So you see the amount of troops that were used, the kind of tactics, also how little bombing there were. I mean, this is not a thing is easy to say in Europe, because it's you become blasted for being a supporter of Putin if you say so. But it is also true that the Russians dropped fewer bombs in the first month of the war than the Americans did on the first 24 hours of the Iraq war. So given the troop levels, the few little bombing, again, it's not because they were necessarily that much better people than we are, but they saw this as something that would undermine the possibility of pushing peace. Because again, they did from day one after the invasion contact the Ukrainians and say, let's now start to discuss neutrality, which you have refused to do for the past 8 years to implement. So I think this idea that Putin would be that Putin would be replaced by someone softer or more pro-Western, I think it's nonsense. I wrote in a Australian think tank when I lived there back in 2015. I think that Putin was the last pro-Western alternative. All the other ones coming after him, they are we're not going to be happy with.
Right. That is a counter to the conventional wisdom, right? Much of elite discourse is about how horrible Putin is, but compared to the alternatives for the leader of Russia, right, Putin realistically is the best person that we could possibly be dealing with.
With what we see, but again, he has to be presented in this way. Just very quickly on the what you said about Trump, I think I think that Putin, to a large extent, he perhaps wanted to go a bit softer to see if the diplomacy went anywhere. Again, I don't know that as a fact, but given what we have talked about as well, that the Ukrainians and Europeans seem to push back, and the Americans, they're also a bit stuck in terms of not moving forward with this. And if diplomacy and a deal can only come with a collapse or partial collapse of the front line, then I think it's better to put the pressure now. This is the main thinking. So. Yes, Alexander also said this signaling that the Kremlin is doing is also quite obvious, because given that Russia for so many years were pursuing this greater Europe, prioritized the integration with the West, many have been worried that if the West began to offer some kind of a reward, that he would jump on this. But we've seen him in terms of his international partners and economic actors within Russia. He's been trying to reassure them, once this war is done, we're not going to just jump back into the arms of the West and try to restore these relations. We're going to prioritize our BRICS partners. We're going to prioritize our domestic economic actors. And I think he also wants to reassure his audience, as well as his military now and political class, that they're not going to sell out some of the objectives of this war. So go for, again, a third Minsk agreement. But I see, again, a big offensive coming in the near future.
I can make one quick point on escalation. Let's assume that the Russians do launch an offensive and it's not very successful, or it's quasi-successful, but the Ukrainians continue to resist and weapons continue to flow and money continues to flow from the United States and from Europe to the Ukrainians. One could argue, if the Russians are not successful on the battlefield in a meaningful way, that the pressure on Putin to really escalate will be very, very great. I believe this is an argument that's sort of embedded in Sergei Karagonov's analysis moving forward. He makes the point, which I think is true, that many people in the West have lost sight of how dangerous nuclear weapons are, and therefore it's a world in which we have to worry about nuclear deterrence not working and ending up in a nuclear war. But he also, I believe, makes the point that the Russians, because they don't have the demographics and they don't have economics on their side, right, that they're not that powerful a country. This is not to say they're a weak country, but they can't fight a forever war.
Right, it's a very dangerous thing to push someone into a corner, right, when people feel trapped and they start rationally calculating that the only way out is to go through you. Right, you're placing yourself in great danger.
War against Ukraine and the West. And at some point, they have to, use unusual means to bring this war to an end. Now, he's hinting at using nuclear weapons in such a scenario, and I'm not arguing that Putin would do that, and I don't think he would. But again, he could really ramp up the attacks on Ukraine in a serious way and try to bring the Ukrainian economy to its knees, wreck the bridges, destroy cities, destroy government installations in a really serious way. sort of try to do to Ukraine what the Israelis did in Gaza. I'm overstating the case a bit. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if you think about what's going to happen over the course of the next year on the battlefield, it's not clear to me that Ukraine stymieing the Russians would be to Ukraine's interest or to our interest. And in fact, if the Russians are successful on the battlefield, as I said,
Right. Many of the things that we most want will ill serve us. And many of the things that we don't want are exactly what we need.
Before, that might be a way of convincing people that this has to be shut down now, which would be all for the good. So I personally feel like I'm in a paradoxical situation where I'm rooting for the Russians to do better rather than worse on the battlefield, because I think that in the end works out best for not just the Russians, but also for the Ukrainians and the West.
I think that's probably true, because whenever
I read a couple of articles that ring true to me. First one, Wall Street Journal over the weekend. For Trump, recent setbacks are a price worth paying for radical change. So my two biggest fears about this new Trump administration were, one, lack of competence, and two, corruption. The Signal chat demonstrated lack of competence. Overall, I'm thrilled with this new Trump administration. It's far more competent than I expected. And out of those two concerns, competence and corruption, right, I'm 20 times more concerned about competence than I am about corruption. And so Wall Street Journal says, President's unorthodox approach to governing prioritizes speed over cautious deliberation. And I see mistakes by the Trump administration, but I see right now, overall, these are worth the price, right? As the Trump administration enacts their top priorities, including slimming down the federal workforce and deporting migrants. And it's hard for me to see how Trump's haphazard tariff policies are going to pay off, but he's done so many impressive things that I'm willing to be open to giving him the benefit of the doubt. Then on Friday, Washington Post published, Trump pushes for changes that keep opposition off balance and are hard to reverse. Again, this rings true. The administration's approach: overwhelm with action, outrun the usual checks on executive power, change government and the country so quickly that some impacts could be irreversible, even if courts later intervene. So Stephen Miller fully expected that invoking wartime powers would invite legal challenges. So he arranged for President Donald Trump to sign the proclamation about enemy aliens late on a Friday night, hoping to jumpstart deportations before a court could respond. Stephen Miller's motto that he often shares with other officials: the most important commodity in the executive branch is time. So Trump is trying to overwhelm with action, outrun the usual checks on executive power, change government in the country so quickly that some impacts could be irreversible, even if courts later intervene. Opponents are so dizzied that they don't know what to fight, and targets of aggression, such as universities, corporations, and law firms, have been cowed into voluntary submission. I am amazed at how many American institutions, from universities to big law firms, are bending the knee to Donald Trump. Steve Bannon says, when you are winning, it's like blitzkrieg. They're surrendering without a fight. This is extraordinary. This is the urgency. You got to keep pounding. Don't let them up. Don't let them have a breath. Don't let them regroup. Don't let them organize. So among the top lessons that Trump aides like Stephen Miller from the first administration learned: force confrontation sooner, hash out the details in court rather than spending time vetting policies before introducing them. And an additional impact of this blitz of action is the response across institutions to avoid Trump's retribution: capitulation. Right? Major companies such as Walmart, McDonald's, Amazon, and Google said they would pull back on diversity programs after Trump campaigned against them. Columbia University agreed to overhaul its own operation under threat of losing $400 million in federal funding. And the law firms Paul Weiss and Skadden Arps, right, agreed to support the administration's programs and to offer a combined $140 million in pro bono legal work to support Trump priorities. So just absolutely dizzying. Trump too. Just whoa. It's just amazing how much he's getting done.
formula. It has an astonishingly powerful court with massive influence.
So Israel's judges are the most powerful judges and the most powerful courts in the world.
It's almost very little political influence over appointments to itself, in the sense of just a full-on veto of appointments to itself. Massive influence of appointments to itself, but also powers that not even the American Supreme Court has, which is a fairly powerful court. How does it work in Israel? There are 9 members of the Judicial Selection Committee. 3 of them are justices of the Supreme Court. 2 represent the executive branch, the cabinet. They're cabinet ministers. 2 represent the Knesset. Traditionally, 1 from the opposition, 1 from the coalition. It hasn't always been so. The new reform actually gives the opposition seat to the opposition by law, so it will no longer be able to be taken away from the opposition. In Australia, because you have direct regional election of an MP, the MP who is popular in his district could still be a check on the prime minister's power, on the executive power, because they can get reelected on their own. Not so in Israel. In Israel, the executive put that person in the parliament, functionally. And so we don't have other checks. There simply aren't any. And so the Supreme Court grew more and more powerful. And there wasn't profound opposition. There were a lot of legal cases and a lot of left-wing law experts and right-wing legal experts who were worried about this expansion of Supreme Court power. There were debates for decades. But there wasn't a popular opposition to it, because it's not clear that there are any other checks in the system to just majority rule, to tyranny of the majority, which is the great problem of democracy since the days of Aristotle. The entire American electoral system is built to offset the majority, to prevent the tyranny of the majority. That's why the House and the Senate and the president are elected on different schedules, to make sure that if a majority forms in one election cycle, it has to be sustained for the next and the next to take over the Senate, right? You can't just sweep all the institutions, all the veto-holding institutions all at once. Tyranny of the majority is the heart of the American system. Avoiding that, Israel has no check on that except the court. And there's another reason the court got massively powerful in Israel that I think is useful to understand. Culturally, even now, it's the most trusted body in government, except for the military in wartime. It's probably also the most serious, the most thoughtful, the most professional in a circus of bad decisions and populism that has kind of defined Israeli politics over the past 20 years, let's say. It's not an accident that the country with the most powerful high court is also the one with the highest number of lawyers per capita. There's something deep and cultural here, and deeply Jewish, okay? Jews love law. Law is intrinsic to their culture, to their religion, to their way of life. Having social rules, having law is associated at the instinctive level in Jewish culture, all Jewish culture, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, ancient, modern, all Jewish cultures associate law with holiness, with life, with social strength and solidarity, with sanctity.
Right. So what love is for Christians, right, it makes Christians' eyes light up, right? Justice and law is for Jews. So I moved to the United States in 1977, and I think in 1981, my family got permanent residency. And I went back to Australia after high school for almost a year. And then 4 years later, I went back to Australia for 8.5 months. And this time when I came back in early 1990, the customs officer told me, look, you could lose your green card. And I was so frightened. And someone close to me said, oh, that's because you were dressed in sweats and you were wearing thongs. But I was frightened. And I immediately set out becoming a U.S. citizen, and became a U.S. citizen in something like 1991. But I noticed most green card holders just have absolute assurance that they have all the same rights as American citizens, except for the right to vote. And you don't, right? There is a difference between permanent resident, right, being a green card holder, and being a citizen. And a lot of people who sound like they are experts, right, are publicly been proclaiming there's no practical difference between permanent residency and citizenship, and they are wrong. So all sorts of things don't matter until they do matter, right? And that many of the differences between permanent resident and citizenship, say with regard to free speech, fall into a gray area but gray is still real. Right? If the Secretary of State of the United States decides you're a national security risk, he can have you deported even if you are a permanent resident, even if you hold a green card. And he cannot do this to you unilaterally if you are a citizen. So the elite news media portray the green card holders and visa holders that the Trump administration are deporting as free speech martyrs who are getting persecuted for their support for Palestine. And more Trump-friendly media portrays people like Mahmoud Khalil as terror supporters. Either way, I don't see how America is hurt by their absence. Right? In theory, I do not like deporting non-citizens for their speech. But the reason that the anti-Israel protests received so much news attention was not for their speech. It was for their illegal behavior of occupying and disrupting American universities. And so if you played a role in promoting illegal behavior, such as taking over buildings, building shanty towns, denying access to facilities to Zionists and the like, if you're interrupting the normal operation of a university, I am absolutely fine to have you deported. Right? A-okay with me. So what do I have? All right, I think this is pretty good. Let me play this.
Hello, this is Victor Davis Hanson for the Daily Signal. How should we characterize the first 7 weeks of the Trump administration? Because we get so much information and misinformation. Almost a day doesn't go by where the Wall Street Journal is predicting that we are headed for a recession, that our allies are furious at us, that the economy is on the brink. So what are we going to make of all this? I think it's time to take a deep breath and envision the first 7 weeks as something like the following. Trump is in a race. He's in a race to enact fundamental disruptive change, a counter-revolution. And it's going to be rough for a while, as he pointed out. But the things that he has already done are going to have shortly, or maybe even midterm, fundamental advantages for the United States. The question is, can he message and can he explicate and explain what he's doing so people hang on? Because the eventual reward will be great. Now, what do I mean? We're talking about tariffs, but even the mere mention of tariffs for all of these countries that have not been reciprocal and have imposed tariffs on us in a way that we would never think of imposing on them, the idea that we might return to parity, it's had an enormous effect. Some $4 trillion of announced investment from the Europeans, from the Saudis, from the Chinese, from the Mexican government, from the Canadians even. That will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, and that is in the process of working out. When Donald Trump entered office in 2017, we were only pumping about 9 million barrels. When he left, we were pumping 12 million. The Biden administration immediately cut back, and then it decided before the midterms, hey, Americans like affordable oil. So then they continued the Trump plan and got up to 12.
All right, so this is an exciting, shattering commentary. It just strikes me as common sense about developments thanks to this Trump administration that we should all be grateful for.
Almost 13 million barrels. Already in just 7 weeks, we have increased the amount of oil produced per day in the United States by about 1/3 of a million barrels, and we're on schedule to get up to about 14 million barrels by the beginning of the year, and that is coordinated with a increase in Middle East production as well. So we're going to see a moderation of energy prices, which may explain already why the inflation rate was not nearly as high as was predicted. If we look at the border, it's amazing. We were told that the border problem was insolvable without comprehensive immigration reform. And there were 10,000 people swarming it per day. We don't even, nonchalantly, nobody talks about it anymore. but it's a revolutionary achievement. There's nobody going across the border illegally, or at least it's statistically insignificant. The big issue right now is the left is cherry-picking judges to prevent not the deportation of somebody who's working, who's never been arrested, who's been here for 5 or 6 years, but criminals and people who already have been ordered out of the country are pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist supporters. But the point I'm making is what we're doing now is phase 2. The border is essentially solved as far as security in 7 weeks. Now we're having the difficult task of trying to find out who these 12 million people were that Biden deliberately and with intent, malicious intent, allowed to come into the country. But the point I'm making is this is an incredible success. There's a final point that I want to make. We hear about Elon Musk is not authentically American, he's a Nepo baby, and we hear Jasmine Crockett threatening his person along with threatening Ted Cruz. All of this chaos and nihilism coming about Elon Musk and what he's doing. But what he's finding out almost every day in the Treasury, in the IRS, in the Department of Energy, in the intelligence communities is a vast, unreported siphoning off of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, to favorable and mostly left-wing entities, both in abroad and here in the United States. And already he has cited areas where the cabinet officers can cut $200 billion. That's a fifth. Only after 7 weeks, he's got a fifth of the way to go. He thinks he can cut $1 trillion without touching entitlements. I don't know if he can, but let me just sum up. If Donald Trump is able to fulfill this promise of commitment by foreign entities of $4 trillion in investment, $4 trillion, if he is able to cut $1 trillion within a year or two, if he is able to solve the Ukraine war, and if he is able to have a general peace in the Middle East, that will be the most substantial presidency, if he does nothing else.
So Victor Davis Hanson, I looked it up, he was never Trump, but he did start out as someone who was not on the Trump bandwagon, did start out as quite skeptical and sometimes critical about Donald Trump. But since Donald Trump first took office, he's been about the most articulate pro-Trump pundit, which I'm aware. I can't think of anyone else in the pundit class who's done a better job making the case for what Donald Trump is doing. Okay, here's another great thing that Trump is doing. New York Times. Companies pull back from pride events as Trump targets DEI. Look, there's been same-sex sex as long as there have been human beings, but why would corporations want to celebrate certain forms of sexual expression? Right? It just, on a common sense basis, does not seem like a good idea, and so organizers of gay pride events say major long-time backers are reducing their support as corporate America retreats from diversity initiatives. I think this is a good idea. I think this is good for gays. It's good for non-gays. All right? You don't want major companies celebrating particular forms of self-expression, right? The last time that we had this much social celebration of LGBTQ identity was in Weimar, Germany. And think about the backlash to Weimar, Germany. So maybe it's a good idea to step back from celebrating this. There are all sorts of major sponsors of pride events, such as Comcast, Anheuser-Busch, not providing funding this year. Pride organizers across the United States say many long-time corporate sponsors are being evasive about their financial commitments, or they are clearly abandoning their support entirely. Right? And pride organizers blame this on Donald Trump's widening crusade against diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has prompted corporate America to retreat from these initiatives. Right? This is a good thing. I asked Grok, what are the dumbest pieties? Right? People often toss around things that sound great but are really stupid. And I like Grok's list of the dumbest pieties, such as everything happens for a reason, hard work always pays off, the customer is always right, time heals all wounds, good things come to those who wait, love conquers all. Sargon of Akkad, aka Carl Benjamin, wrote something smart on Twitter the other day. It says Trump's belligerence towards Canada, along with the cold vase his administration has shown to America's allies more broadly, has hurt the right-wing cause in every other country. It has allowed the left to claim the nationalist position and made right-wingers seem like patsies of a hostile foreign power or liars that when they say they don't want the same thing as Donald Trump. So there is growing anti-American feeling around the world as a result of Trump's belligerence and hostility and bullying towards many of America's closest allies. And why do gays love poppers more than straights? And apparently the appeal of poppers, it's a quick high, heightened sensory experience and relaxation of the smooth muscles, including the anal sphincter, which can make anal sex more comfortable or enjoyable. So I never hear any of my straight friends talking about the glories of poppers. So after Donald Trump's disgraceful denials of the fairly clear 2020 election results, I lost most of my enthusiasm for Donald Trump until he was raided by the FBI and indicted in New York on what struck me as spurious grounds. And it's this lawfare and democratic overreach that reignited my enthusiasm for Donald Trump. So there's nobody who writes for The Atlantic who is pro-Trump. All right, this magazine, it's a fairly centrist magazine, but 100% opposed to Donald Trump. And we've got Paul Rosenzweig writing last week, the pathetic, cowardly collapse of big law. Right? And so I'm not a big fan of these kind of sweeping condemnations. You have to understand the reasons why people act the way they do. So this guy says, Trump and his supporters defend these actions on the childhood playground basis that the Democrats started it. Right? Who started a fight is not childish. Right? It is a strong legal argument. In many instances, it's often a strong moral argument. In reality, in real life, who starts a fight matters, right? Even Grok supports me. Determining who starts a fight is often crucial, especially in legal contexts, right? In law, establishing the instigator will shape the case. Self-defense claims, such as where the aggressor's identity can decide guilt or innocence. Right? The idea that it's childish, right? That might stem from playground squabbles and just tired parents who don't want to figure things out. And the focus is more on blame than on resolution. But in adult conflicts, whether physical, verbal, or geopolitical, right, identifying who started the fight provides context, clarifies motives, and dictates the legitimacy of responses. Right? It's only childish if the pointing of the finger is just petty score settling, not if it's about understanding what really happened. Context is everything. So Paul Rosenzweig writes, Trump's actions against big law are an attempt to tilt the scales of justice by using the raw power of government coercion, and they're working. Right? The right has never enjoyed this much success in transforming American institutions, which even now are still predominantly in the hands of the left. Right? And there's a Protestant thinker who I like, Aaron Renn, and he noted earlier this year, conservatives cannot use the long march strategy because the left is not dumb enough to let them penetrate institutions. Right? Conservatives need to do the equivalent of a private equity buyout and restructure institutions from the top down. And that's what Elon Musk and Donald Trump are doing. So Trump's war on big law is effective. And it's worth understanding, why is it so effective? And we've got all these rival firms such as Sullivan and Cromwell and Kirkland and Ellis who have begun poaching talent from the targeted firms, right, exploiting the instability that Trump's actions have created. And the New York Times, to its credit, is flooding the zone on Trump's war with big law. And they have a story here from Friday, I think. Skadden, top law firm, is in talks to avert an executive order, and there are 5 reporters on this story. The discussion comes as President Trump has taken aim at Wilmer Hale, another big law firm. Other major firms are trying to cut deals with the White House. Law is great. Principles are great. Morality is great. But often the most important thing is power, and having power on your side to protect you. So the elite law firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom has been in discussions with President Trump about cutting a deal, and Skadden Arps cut the deal, and they said they would provide $100 million worth of pro bono work for groups that Donald Trump wants. Now, other firms are fighting the Trump administration. So which firms are settling and which firms are fighting? And this isn't made clear in almost all commentary, but there are very specific reasons why some law firms feel emboldened to fight Donald Trump and other law firms bend the knee. And it's not because of the inherent righteousness or courage or cowardice of individuals. It's all because of the details of the particular situation. Right? Those firms who are settling with Donald Trump are doing so because fighting him is a bad strategy for them. Other firms, right, they have reason to believe that fighting the Trump administration's orders are a winning formula. Right? Not all law firms are created equal, and it's worth understanding what are the differences, what leads some firms to fight and other firms to settle. So will big law band together amid Trump's barrage? Well, different law firms and different powerful lawyers have different incentives, right? And what usually happens in these type of situations, right? Corporate law firms are using Trump's assault as a competitive opportunity. Most people will use most events to try to advance their own interests. I came over to visit a woman that I was dating, but I hadn't yet had sex with her. But she was very upset because her apartment had been broken into. And so I didn't just go visit her because she asked me to, and I didn't just go visit her out of the kindness of my heart, right? I also went to visit her because I hoped that we would have sex, and we did. Right? She was so upset by having her apartment broken into that she wanted to have sex. And why is Trump mounting these attacks on law firms, right? The elite news media coverage is, oh, Trump wants to abolish the rule of law and become a dictator. But some of it is revenge for the lawfare, overreaching lawfare that was conducted against him. And some of it is to try to right the situation in America where so many of our major institutions are tilted against the interests of regular Americans, right? Even though it's been illegal since the 1965 Voting Rights Act to discriminate on the basis of race, for the past 50 years, discrimination against white people has been widespread and even praised, right? Diversity efforts mean we discriminate against white people, against men, against straights, right? Law firms, big law firms, overwhelmingly lean left. Overwhelmingly, they publicly champion, push, and provide the brain trust of the Democratic Party to enact a left-wing social agenda. They have frequently fired conservatives or not allowed conservatives in their ranks to represent conservative clients, and they consistently use anti-white racial preferences for applicants and employees. So now we've got the Equal Opportunity Commission, right, federal agency tasked with policing employment discrimination, right, sending letters to 20 of the biggest law firms requesting information about their race-based employment practices. So one of the most annoying things, time-consuming things that happen in litigation is that the other side gets to ask you discovery questions, and you have to reveal a whole bunch of things that you would rather keep secret. So half of the letters suggest that these big law firms, right, hold attorney applicants to different standards depending on their race, right? Top law firms it seems, require lower GPAs for Black and Hispanic applicants than they do for Asian and white students. And they often recruit Asian and white students from lower ranked schools than they would the latter. So law firms might refuse to disclose this information, which might raise the inference that they are guilty. All right, the letters describe the firm's diversity scholarships and diversity internships, offering priority access to job interviews, pipelines to employment, to power, to stipends, to scholarships on the basis of protected non-white racial identities. Some firms think they were really clever. They would outsource this discrimination to third parties. So Kirkland and Ellis, for example, partners with an organization called Afro Law, which gives Afro students a pipeline to employment with Kirkland that is denied to applicants of other races. Many law firms partner with Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, SEO, which does the same thing, gives priority to certain racial groups such as Blacks and Hispanics. Right? They put their favored racial group on fast tracks to employment. They entitle their racial groups to extra pay, scholarships, mentoring. Right? All sorts of advantages are given to students of color. And all sorts of discrimination is used against white people and men. Right? Then there are affinity groups. Right? There are all sorts of employee groups organized around certain racial, ethnic, and sexual identities, such as gay. And participation in these groups seems to be a factor in getting promoted. Right? These groups have a special privilege of employment that Christians and men and white people do not have. Firms often provide annual reports and plans for increasing demographic representation, which in practice means anti-white discrimination. They often say that their firm's partner compensation is tied to diversity goals, which means practice anti-white discrimination. Right? Firms pay bigger recruitment bonuses to employees who recruit favored Black and Hispanic candidates. So maybe ordinary Americans aren't thrilled with this. Ruth Marcus writes for The New Yorker how Donald Trump throttled big law. Right, Ruth Marcus is on the left. She recently resigned from the Washington Post to protest owner Jeff Bezos's interference in the operation of the Post. She writes now in The New Yorker, President Trump has two goals: to seek revenge and to intimidate lawyers challenging his agenda. Right? Are top law firms cutting deals with him? Is this a necessary act of survival, or is this a damaging blow to the entire profession? Right? These deals, such as by Paul Weiss, and the studied silence of other law firms who refuse to speak out against these orders, guys, it offers an alarming illustration of how impressively Trump's campaign is succeeding. So it's useful to hear what our political enemies are saying. Even before this latest spate of executive orders, all sorts of law firms were skittish about finding themselves at odds with the new administration. Now they are terrified, and they are lining up their own outside counsel. Right? Only a fool represents himself. Trump might be coming for them next. Trump said this past week firms were to submit to his will. The law firms have to behave themselves, he said. Well, his will seems to largely correlate with my own interest. I think it's great. Right? It's hard to see how Trump's orders will pass constitutional muster, she claims. It's also difficult to see how some of these firms, like Perkins Coie, do not emerge grievously damaged. Right? Some clients, new and existing, may be steering business in a different direction. Right? Clients with issues before the government would have to think twice before hiring a law firm at war with the Trump administration. Right? A corporate general counsel will have a difficult time explaining why retaining their law firm at war with Trump is in the best interests of the law firm's shareholders. So the particular firm, Paul Weiss, presented a juicy target for Trump because of the major New York firms. Its profile was the most aligned with the Democratic Party. Sounds good to me, bro.
Don't know is a very personal story about Alex's life, about growing up in an observant Jewish family in Boston.
So this is the comic Alex Edelman, And he wants to have a conversation. He's all in favor of conversations. So I notice this desire to have conversations is a major talking point on the left. It's not so much of a talking point on the right. And it's annoying because it's so duplicitous, right? They want to have certain conversations and they don't want to have other conversations. Overwhelmingly, censorship in America over the past 20 years has far more come from the left than the right. They've been far more interested in shutting down conversations. And this particular bloke, Alex Edelman, he doesn't want to have a conversation with me, right? I sent him an interview request. He did not respond. So it's just phony and annoying.
Boston.
For whiteness. I grew up in Boston. I grew up in this really racist part of Boston called Boston.
And he tells the story of
So he's an Orthodox Jew, modern Orthodox, I would assume. Would he be willing to speak out against Jewish racism?
going to a meeting of white nationalists in Queens.
And the tweet says, if you live in NYC and you have questions about your whiteness, come to 441 27th Avenue. And I thought to myself, I live in NYC. And as
Right, liberals love this. It reminds me of Ronnie Goldman's experience at Stanford Law School. Right, his liberal professors, the parents of Sam Bankman-Fried, they arranged all sorts of wonderful things, a scholarship, a stipend for Ronnie Goldman, so he could pursue his research into how conservatives experience cultural oppression, because they thought he would end up by showing how fatuous that was. But because he ended up expressing some empathy and sympathy for the conservative point of view, right, they felt let down, and they essentially washed their hands of Ronnie Goldman, or at least that's how he presents the story in his memoir.
As an Ashkenazi Jew, I have some questions about my whiteness.
And in the course of going to this meeting, someone outs him as a Jew. So it's very much a story of his experience.
So he wants to have all these conversations. Has he had conversations with anyone skeptical? Anyone who pushes back on his preferred narratives?
And his thoughts about Judaism and how we should be talking to each other. When Alex performed his show, it was before the presidential election last year. And so it was a different time. But Alex told me that he had just heard that there was a theater in Minnesota that was going to be putting on his show just for us. They were going to be using his stand-up script, and the actor was going to be essentially impersonating him. And immediately he said he had to go see it, and he had to go see it in.
I'd be really interested in seeing a non-Jewish, non-white, non-male performer do a version of that.
And is that because, I'm curious why?
Because Norman Lear, who I completely worshipped, liked to say that I'm just another version of you. And Norman created all these shows like All in the Family, but he also did like Sanford and Sons and Ma.
So I'm curious if he has this same attitude towards the right.
And Mary Hartman, and a bunch of shows where it wasn't just about Norman Lear. These shows were fully inhabited with this humanity. And one of my professors at college,
so people exploring their Black identity, their gay identity, their Mexican-American identity, their Filipino-American identity, all right, they get honored in elite discussions and elite news media coverage. Right? People exploring their Jewish identity often receive similar honor, but nobody exploring their white identity receives this honor.
Nathan Englander likes to say that when people are told, write what you know, sometimes they go, oh, if I'm a farmer, I should write about being a farmer. If I'm from a poor background, I should write about being from that specific poor background. But what he means is if you...
So how much empathy does he really show for people who are exploring their white identity?
You know shame, write shame. If you know ambition, write ambition. If you know what it feels like to be informed by a world that you come from, but also a longing to completely fit in with the greater world at large, write about that. And so I'm curious to see someone who's coming at that specific angle of wanting to belong, but coming from a place where that may not be the easiest thing. I'm wondering if the story still works for them, if the filter of it is through something other than their Judaism.
So you mentioned in another interview that the show is the best, truest expression of yourself. So what did you find out watching yourself?
I'm so annoying. I'm so annoying and so Jewish. Can someone tone down the Jewish for this time period that we live in? Gosh. I mean, in 2025, to be this Jewish seems almost irresponsible. I mean, a little bit is, but no. I think watching it, I do think certain things come through. The things that I love come through. The love of my family and my identity, and weirdly, there's something like patriotic about it, which is the idea, not to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't seen the show, the idea that not that these people can be reached.
Oh, so some identities, it's super cool to have certain identities, but other identities are, well, that's just like the Nazis.
The white nationalists in the room, but the idea that you'd want to.
Right.
Is very, I think, like weirdly patriotic.
Right.
And the idea, also the neediness of someone who wants to connect with everyone.
That's you.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susanna.
You're welcome.
But seeing that.
But that idea.
Yeah, does he really? Right, that does not ring true to me. Right, that seems performative and pretentious.
Of being I'm not saying the neediness necessarily, just the interest in hearing other people.
Sure.
Right?
Isn't
that the core of the show?
Oh, 1,000%. And also, I do think...
Right. Much of success in life is giving people who have power and the ability to help you, right, tell them what they want to hear. And it sure sounds to me like this is what Alex Edelman is doing, right? He's giving the people in power what they want to hear.
Not to be earnest here, I do think that wanting that right now feels more... feels interesting in a different way, like the aspects of the show that appeal to...
Wow, he thinks that his own story, flattering the people with power, right, has ever more importance and relevance to today. Shocking.
People.
Do you think that has changed? Are you saying post-Trump?
Yeah.
Talk about the show before Trump and then how the show is received after Trump.
Well,
oh, poor man having to suffer through being featured once again in the New York Times. All right, back to The Atlantic, another elite journal, March 24. The United States of fear. For anyone who's in the president's crosshairs or could be, it's the dominant emotion of Trump's second term. Law firms are taking steps to protect themselves. One Washington firm hired a vendor to scan right-wing message boards for threats that might bubble up to the White House and occasion attack from the president. The firm also modified its document retention policy in preparation for possible government probes. So you don't think that conservatives have experienced fear with most of our institutions in the hands of the left? Our conservatives are far more reluctant to speak out on political issues and on matters of traditional morality, such as the traditional definition of marriage between a man and a woman. They're much less likely to do that with strangers or in the workplace because they have experienced firsthand how vicious the left will be towards them. Now, why are some law firms fighting Trump, and why are some law firms settling with Trump? And all the media coverage prior to this one particular article, right, essentially said that the firms fighting Trump were the good guys and the firms settling with Trump were pathetic, spineless, cowardly losers. But that's not really what's going on. Right? Why are some firms settling with Trump? Right, we've got a Yale law professor here writing in the Wall Street Journal, March 28, John Morley. Right? Law firms are fragile businesses. Right? The more you get to know people, right, the more you realize that everyone has a substantial amount of fragility and vulnerability. Right? Even if this incredibly multi-billion-dollar law firm, Paul Weiss, had lost just a handful of clients, right, it could have been destroyed. Right? Law firms are not like most businesses. Law firms are owned by certain of their workers, right? The partners, right? So partners are primarily not paid in salaries, but in shares of profit. And so they can leave at any time and take their clients with them. So why do law firms go bankrupt? Because their clients can go down the elevator at any time. So law firms are all exposed to a risk of cascading spiral of partner withdrawals akin to a run on a bank. Just one partner leaves and takes his clients with him, the firm will lose revenue, but will still be stuck with its office lease, its staff salaries, and all the other expenses it had before. So the result will be a decline in profits, which will mean a decline in pay for the partners who remain. And once their pay goes down, more of these partners will likely decide to leave the firm. And then their departures will damage the firm even further, pushing more partners to leave, and so on. And so by virtue of their status as owners of the firm, the partners face unusual forms of liability that reward them and incentivize them for leaving earlier rather than later. Right? Incentives operate in a way that punishes the partners who leave late. Right? A partner who stays too long at a firm in distress can lose his past and future pay to creditors of the firm in a bankruptcy. The partner who gets out earlier avoids these risks. Right? These death spirals are a common feature of the legal industry. Right? Dozens of big law firms have collapsed in partner runs. Most recent was Strzok and Lavin, that crumbled in just a few months in 2023. Now, Paul Weiss on the outside looks like an incredibly powerful firm. Paul Weiss accumulated its power and money by pursuing a strategy of hiring star lawyers, right? Mega rainmakers who brought in lots of clients and kept other lawyers busy. And this made the firm extremely successful. But it also left it vulnerable. If one of these stars were to leave, the damage to the firm in lost client revenue and underused associates and office space would be swift, and it would be devastating and even deadly. So Paul Weiss achieved its success by adding partners who do transaction work, right? Transaction works refers to contracts. But transactional lawyers can switch firms much more easily than litigators can, and they depend more heavily on good relations with the government. So as a result, Paul Weiss was much more exposed to pressure from the government than Perkins Coie and Williams and Connolly, which is defending Perkins Coie. So Perkins Coie has fewer of its partners devoted to transactional work than Paul Weiss. Williams and Connolly does only litigation, right? They specialize in fighting the government. So these firms have already hardened their businesses to withstand conflict from the government in a way that the Paul Weiss law firm never could. So Donald Trump's attacks on law firms are more powerful than they seem. Some firms might successfully resist, but other firms run unbearably high odds of catastrophic loss. So even if Paul Weiss could have prevailed in a lawsuit, it may well have crumbled and dissolved into bankruptcy before it could leave the courthouse.
Well, while I was in Minnesota, I did some door-to-door work for this candidate in Minnesota who's running in like a pretty competitive seat that I really like. And the mood was, I sort of knew which way the election was going to shake out. And so I guess I was sort of curious how the show would play that close to the election, how a sort of like love letter to civility or something.
Right.
The show is ultimately, there's a little bit of wish fulfillment in the show.
So I noticed that many liberals who want to write love letters to civility are perfectly happy calling conservatives fascists and dictators and authoritarian and Nazis. So the civility usually only extends to certain groups.
Show, which is that we can all speak civilly to each other and offer each other both empathy.
And so civility also means speaking in terms that are politically correct, which mean you do not accurately describe reality, right? It's not civil to say that President Biden was demonstrating signs of senility. So he wants a rigged playing field in favor of his team, but he calls it civility and an open conversation and empathy and courtesy and humanitarianism and all these wonderful things.
And accountability, even in the most extreme environment, right?
Right.
Like even in a room full of white nationalists with some neo-Nazi views.
Right. So when you were performing it on Broadway in 2023, I feel like you were kind of against the tide when you were first doing it.
I feel like there was a moment for that opinion, and I wonder how that opinion holds up now in terms of like loving civility and the rule of discourse and favoring conversation that is productive over conversation where you are the party that is right. Is like, I wonder if that still holds the same currency that it did when I was doing it on Broadway or during a Biden administration.
Is it harder to make the argument that you do with your show that we really need to be talking to each other?
No.
Or is it more relevant?
I don't know that it's more relevant. The truth is, I think in principle, people...
Okay, so he really wants us to talk to each other. So which right-wing shows has he been on? Right. Which people has he given an interview to who challenged him? Right. Certainly doesn't want to talk to me.
People quite like the idea that they can have productive civil conversations with people who have fundamental differences from them. But as soon as you introduce like Democrat and Republican, those things start to break down, right? People start to say, well, yes, but in this case, they're not civil, or in this case, they wouldn't actually listen to me, or in this case, there isn't actually civility. I did the show on Broadway in August of 2020.
So to the extent that I'm able to be honest with myself, and I think I have some success there, right? This feels bogus to me. It feels performative. It feels like he's running a con, right? It doesn't feel honest and trustworthy to me, and it gets annoying. So I was looking at the New York Times the other day, and apparently law firms are sometimes aligned with a political party. Right, this kind of dishonesty discredits the New York Times and other news media. Right, it's just such a bogus frame, just sometimes aligned. Right, law firms are sometimes aligned with a political party. Right, there are no major big law Republican firms, right? Jones Day has done work on behalf of Republicans, but it's not a Republican law firm, right? This is just so incredibly dishonest. And what's my evidence? I asked Grok, right? And Grok says, 40, you are right to question the framing. The New York Times statement, law firms are sometimes aligned with a political party, is technically true, but it underplays a clear pattern. Big law, meaning the top tier, high-revenue firms like Paul Weiss, Skadden, or Latham & Watkins lean heavily Democratic. Right? Campaign contributions from lawyers at these firms show a consistent, dramatic skew towards Democrats, often by as much as 10-1. Right? In 2020, Paul Weiss lawyers donated over $2 million to Democrats and $50,000 to Republicans. Right? That's not just a sometimes thing. That's a structural tilt. The legal profession, especially at the elite level, draws from urban, coastal, highly educated circles that are on the left. 68% of lawyers identify as liberal or on the left compared to 25% conservative, but big law amplifies that. Its culture, its client base, right? Think tech, finance, media, recruitment pipeline, Ivy League universities align with the left. So to say that law firms sometimes align with a political party, all right, it's just so plainly dishonest. And it annoys people, even easygoing people such as myself.
But then its tour was post-October 7th, while there was this major conflict in Gaza, and the atmosphere around discourse and Jewish identity changed drastically.
Right.
And so that was different.
Right. There are just dozens of celebratory news stories about exploring Jewish identity. I can't remember many news stories with a positive spin on people who are, say, celebrating white identity. God forbid.
All right. Tufts University graduate student grabbed off the street by federal immigration officers. This is part of this new push to disappear these people that were participating in these campus protests. Let's take a look at this. I'm not for this. I also am not for, I wasn't, no one asked, no, I didn't vote on letting any of these people into the country. No one did, by the way. But I'm certainly not for removing people that have a differing opinion. That is free speech. I don't think that's the right way to go. Do I think it's a problem that we have a lot of foreign students in America and we don't care about the American ones? Yes, absolutely I do. But let's watch this disappearance. Is this being done for America or for Israel? I mean, this is a fair question. Is the United States government now just taking edicts and orders from Israel? I think it's a fair question to ask. Does anyone feel safer with this woman off the streets? Is this the American government's? Is this what people voted for when they elected Trump? Is to have a country taking orders from Israel? I don't think so. And now, I'm sure me and this woman would disagree on lots of things. And I'm very, very much a proponent of strict, tight immigration controls. But she's a legal U.S. resident. She participated in pro-Palestinian protests as a legal U.S. resident. Her arrest follows the White House's crackdown on what is classified as anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses. What is this? And does anyone feel uncomfortable with this? Does anyone feel weird that anti-Semitism can now get you deported if you are a legal U.S. citizen? Is that odd? What other isms are coming? I don't understand this. I think people that commit crimes, it's a different story. But
okay, so if these arrests and deportations are solely on matters of speech, then I think Tim Dillon has a stronger point. But if these arrests and deportations are because these individuals who are being deported are destroying the ability of American universities to do their thing, and because these people are connected to terror groups, then I think the deportations are great.
To speak out against an ally of America should not be grounds for someone to be deported. And we look right now like we are doing this at the behest of Mary Madelson and the big billionaire donors that have been very good to both parties in America. I couldn't think of anything that would feed Jewish conspiracy theories more than this, by the way. I could not think of it. If you wanted Jewish conspiracy theories to kind of, slow down, I don't know if this was helping. I don't know. If you think Israel has too much influence in our country, is this helping correct that belief? Asking. Just throwing it out there. Would this be the way if people say to you, hey, Israel runs America through donors, and you say that's silly and absurd and ridiculous? Does this happening make people more or less? Do they dig their heels into that belief more or less? That, by the way, remember when for like 4 years you could say anything about white people? Anything. Kill them. How about we genocide the whites? Fuck white men. They should die. Let's deny them health care. But there was a few campus protests for like a month. And now they're like deporting students. There was like years and years of shitting on whitey. And then no one really cared. No one's getting deported. What about the people that said negative things about, other countries? I mean, Will you get deported if you're racist against Filipinos? Because I have been, and it's only because my godson, they told me he was Chinese because he was so little I couldn't tell, and I said I will pay for his school, and then now he's Filipino. But I didn't know that at the time, and I would not have gotten involved. No shade, I just want high end. Chinese, Japanese, that's it. Now,
I remember when my father was the focus of this Glacier View Seventh Day Adventist Church conference in Colorado in September of 1980, when it looked like my father was going to get kicked out of the church ministry. This very emotional church figure was coming to our cabin, and he saw me, that I was there, and I was listening to my father being critiqued and criticized and torn apart by other people in the church. And he said, if you decide to go to medical school, right, I'll pay your way. Right? There's not an iota of chance in the world that I would ever end up at medical school. It's not among my strong points, right? It was pretty safe there to promise to pay my way through medical school.
To ensure the B-2s have everything they need for their bombing runs. Radio Chatter has also revealed what the US is planning. TWZ says that 2 B-2 bomber crews operating under the call signs Pitch 11 and Pitch 14 were heard communicating with Australian air traffic control in March. That radio conversation, which is publicly available, also confirmed the presence of a third B-2, though that aircraft's crew wasn't involved in the conversation. The trio of US bombers then stopped off in Australia, where they refueled before continuing their journey to Diego Garcia. This aspect of the TWZ report is interesting. It shows that the US isn't attempting to keep the B-2's movements a secret, reinforcing the idea that it's trying to project force against Iran. More radio chatter comes from other B-2s. A fourth, operating under the call sign Pitch 13, appears to have been en route to Diego Garcia before having to make an emergency landing at Hawaii's Hickam Air Force Base. TWC says that we don't know the nature of that emergency yet, though images shared on Twitter show that the bomber was met on the tarmac by a crashed truck. More air traffic radio chatter came from another B-2 with the call sign ABBA. Typically stationed at Missouri's Whiteman Air Force Base, that bomber is also en route to Diego Garcia. Whether it's serving as a replacement for Pitch 13 or was also intended to make this journey isn't known. If it's the latter, that makes 5 B-2s either on Diego Garcia or heading to the island. That's a quarter of the 20 B-2 bombers currently stationed at the Whiteman base, which is also the US Air Force's full stock of B-2s. If there was any doubt about where these B-2s were heading, it was all dispelled by two things: a later TWZ update and comments from the United States. On March 26, TWZ confirmed that satellite images obtained from Planet Labs show that there were at least 3 B-2s on Diego Garcia. Those images also revealed even more equipment being amassed on the island, including another C-17 cargo plane, 7 KC-135 aerial tankers, and what appears to be a P-8A Poseidon Maritime.
Whoa, I love that stuff, man. I love those Tom Clancy techno thrillers. Right, Steve Saylor has a blog post. Was the Great Gatsby black, or was he Jewish? Right, in the New York Times, former film critic A.O. Scott concludes his article on the 100th anniversary of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Right, the theory that Gatsby was a black man in whiteface has been a topic in academic scholarship for some time. And there's a brilliant essay apparently in The Atlantic about Gatsby's ambiguous identity. All right, was he black? Was he Jewish? Was he gay? Well, no, he wasn't black. He wasn't Jewish, and he wasn't gay. Right? And it's pretty doggone clear. So right, what is The Great Gatsby all about? Is it about race? Is it about gay themes? Is it about ethnicity? Is it about the Jewish question? No, it's about social class and feeling homesick for the Midwest. Right? Nick, the protagonist, is homesick for the Midwest. But Americans used to have a lot more sympathy regarding feeling homesick. There's a book, Homesickness in American History. But over the course of the 20th century, big institutions noticed that their tasks were much simpler if they could get Americans to view homesickness as childish, like deciding who's right or who started a fight, and instead agree that all neighborhoods are fungible. So nobody remembers that Gatsby is Lutheran and that the protagonist's sad feeling is due to his homesickness for his hometown. So now many people's hometowns and neighborhoods have been taken over by immigrants, and everything that they were fond of, everything that was familiar to them has been destroyed. But this is childish, guys. You're not supposed to think this way. Silly you, right? You need to overcome these tendencies. Whatever happened to Silicon Valley's most infamous thought criminal, James Damore? He's the author of that misogynist Google memo. He was banished from the tech world. He became a digital hermit. Now his ideas are being vindicated. Will he be? So now he's living in Luxembourg because he could not get hired in the United States. So he was earning about $500,000 a year plus at Google. And he wrote the infamous Google memo, officially titled Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, right? In August of 2017, he argued that it wasn't bias that made women so underrepresented in tech, but that men and women might have biological differences and that this might play a role, and that Google's programs that seek to achieve male-female parity in tech jobs are actually discriminating against men, because nearly every difference between men and women is interpreted as a form of women's oppression. And he argued that Google was so politically biased in favor of DEI that it was impossible to openly discuss these issues. And he said the lack of discussion fosters the most extreme and authoritarian elements of this ideology. So Alex Edelman, who seems to be on the left, right, he wants discussion. Liberals love discussion, but only very limited forms of discussion, such as about how evil white people are. Right? And that James Damore was fired by Google once his memo went public kind of bolstered his argument. Right? Conservatives were routinely being attacked and protested on college campuses. They were pushed out of corporations. And it was impossible for him to find a job. He applied, he says, to hundreds of places. Right? He was earning over $500,000 a year. He ended up working as a camp counselor, a board game designer, a professional player of the Magic the Gathering card game, and he sold T-shirts and tchotchkes on Redbubble. So he moved to Austin, and he fell in love with a Mexican-American fashion designer. She was unaware of the whole memo scandal. She looked me up and she thought, big tech bro based on the articles. And that's what she initially thought, and then realized he was just sincere. The couple married 2 years ago, expecting their first child. They abandoned the United States for Luxembourg, where James Damore can get a job as a senior software engineer. So Nathan Kofnas, he also couldn't get into an elite university graduate program in philosophy because he had a track record of writing for the National Review. Couldn't get hired at a major elite American university, so he went to the United Kingdom, where he was hired by Cambridge. So James Damore has become a digital hermit. Doesn't really post online. And now he is vindicated, right? Trump is signing all these executive orders, doing away with DEI programs. And Steven Pinker had an excellent reaction to this when it was all going down back in 2017. So August 8, 2017, Steven Pinker wrote, Google drives a big sector of tech into the arms of Trump, fires employee who wrote memo about women in tech jobs. Right, good on Steven Pinker, right? Pinker is on the left, but He's willing to tell important truths. Right, the all-in podcast billionaires have traditionally been in the center-left, but they are now increasingly aligned with Donald Trump.
Okay, let's move on to our final two stories. The Trump administration has deported 238 alleged gang members to a pretty severe prison called CECOT, C-E-C-O-T prison in El Salvador. Here's a clip of them being dragged out of the United States and put into this extremely notorious prison. This was all done under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This allows the president to detain and deport individuals without due process from, quote, an enemy nation during an invasion or, quote, predatory incursion. It's been used before, but only during actual wars. FDR used it to deport thousands of Germans, Italians, Japanese during World War II. The Trump administration is claiming that the gang members were sent to the U.S., intentionally calling them a hybrid criminal state. Not surprisingly, most of them, or not all of them, had criminal records in the U.S. This was confirmed by ICE. And obviously, some number of them appear to have been misidentified as gang members or terrorists. I can tell you, coming from a law enforcement family and just looking at the statistics, out of 238, you're not going to bat 1,000. So maybe you get a couple of these wrong. Former pro soccer player, Jersey Reyes Barrios. He fled Venezuela after being tortured by the government for protesting. He's a refugee. He has been mistaken for a gang member, according.
Right, these are not citizens. Right, they don't have the rights of citizens. I don't know what rights they have in the United States. Right, if they're in the country illegally, let's deport them, even if they play soccer, even if they're gay.
To his people, because he's got an arm tattoo supporting his favorite club, Real Madrid. And there is a social.
Yeah, look, I'm fine with deporting people for having tattoos. Right, having a tattoo shows that you have really poor judgment.
Media post that ICE officials believe featured him making gang signs, but it was actually the language for I love you, according to his attorney. Second example, a shoe salesman and social media influencer, Norberto Rodriguez. He fled Venezuela for Colombia out of desperation because he and his family were starving. He's a father of 3. He was also suspected because of a tattoo, which features playing cards and dice. His family says he got it to cover a scar on his forearm. And third and final example, stylist and makeup artist Andre Hernandez. He is being represented by the Immigration Defenders Law Center. He claims he has no criminal history. He sought asylum after fleeing Venezuela, where he was persecuted for being gay. Again, his arrest was based on tattoos that his attorneys claim are not.
If you have a minority identity that triggers the revulsion of people with conflicting hero systems, right, you're going to experience persecution.
Gang affiliated. This has caused a U.S. district judge to pause these deportations. The administration has apparently continued these deportations, and they're even gloating by doing videos, highly produced videos, threatening people with the prison in El Salvador, again, the CECOT. Your thoughts, Chamath, on this extradition process, if any?
I mean, as long as there's a mechanism for these mistakes to get rectified, seems like the overwhelming majority of these folks should not have been in the United States and were part of illegal criminal organizations.
Okay, so there should be a mechanism. Gavin, your thoughts?
If innocent people were sent to a prison, like that's a terrible mistake. And that happens. And it shouldn't happen, and hopefully it gets rectified. But I guess my bigger thought is a little.
Having a ton of people in the country illegally, right? That's also a terrible thing. Right. Some great stuff in Chronicles magazine, right? Donald Trump managed to end the flood of illegal crossings within weeks of taking office, right? What Trump has done on immigration is extraordinary, right? And what he accomplished, it was done contrary to the best wisdom of the experts, right? It did not require grand congressional bargains like many Republicans were pushing. It didn't require a new climate deal. We didn't have to make Honduras great again to stop the caravans, right? All we had to do was secure the border, right? Trump understood, right? Trump is taking action that protects our country, and often in the face of opposition from our elites.
A little bit, this administration, as we discussed, they have a really ambitious agenda. They want to fundamentally change America in ways that they think will be better for kind of blue-collar, normal working Americans. And things like this, Signalgate, if they made a mistake and sent innocent people to this prison, there's only so many of those mistakes they can afford before they lose kind of the mandate necessary to accomplish their goals. And, hopefully it's, we're in whatever, we're not even into the, third full month.
66 days.
66 days. We're into the third month.
Right. What about the human rights, the suffering that Americans have endured and the crime, right, from people in the country illegally, or even the flood of legal immigrants, right, completely transforming neighborhoods that people grew up in?
But
we're 4.5% of the way through the second term, and it feels like
yeah,
6 Scaramucci's in.
Yeah,
with brutal. It ain't easy here. This is such a good point, though, Gavin. Continue.
Execution matters. Like if they to accomplish their goals, they need to execute at a high level and communicate clearly and effectively. And just if innocent people were sent to this prison, mistake. Signalgate, look, hey, maybe it's a big mistake, maybe it's a small mistake, depending on where you sit. I thought Marco Rubio's response was good, but just like I think execution is important for them to accomplish their goals.
Great. Freeberg, any thoughts here?
I do not agree with sending people to prison or detention center without due process. I felt similarly about Guantanamo Bay because I don't think it matches.
They're not citizens, right? I'm not sure they have any rights.
The rights and the values that the United States should stand for. I think it's different if you believe that they're here illegally, they're part of a criminal.
Yeah, what about the values of trying to maintain the coherence, cohesion, and social trust of our nation?
Enterprise, and we don't want to try them in courts here, then we should ship them back to a port of departure somewhere else in another country. Maybe it's back to Venezuela and let their courts try them. But I will talk a little bit about this El Salvador motivation. As you guys know, the El Salvador prison that they set up for putting the gang members in had a radical impact on living standards in the country. In 2015, the homicide rate per capita in El Salvador was 103 people per 100,000. So 1 out of every 1,000 people were murdered every year. They introduced this aggressive policy of rounding people up without due process and putting them in this prison. And through that action, they were able to reduce the homicide rate per capita below 2 per 100,000, which is what it was last year, 1.9. So it had a radically positive effect on society, but obviously at the cost of a value that we in the United States hold dear, which is the value of due process and the importance of due process, because all it takes is one innocent life being locked up.
But sorry, you're saying El Salvador, there was no due process?
There was no due process. And so there are plenty of stories. If you watch the documentaries on this prison, there are plenty of stories of people that later were released when they were found to be completely innocent and randomly rounded up or caught up in a sweep or something that they shouldn't have been at. And there was actually one fascinating interview I saw of one of the guys who spent over a year in the prison, was completely innocent. But he said, you know what, it was worth it because the government's been able to clean up the streets. I got to find this clip, but I was really shocked. I couldn't believe that a guy that spent a year in this prison actually had something positive to say, because it was such a
maybe you had to say that to get out. Who knows?
Well, it was such a profoundly difficult place to live in El Salvador. And we've all heard these stories. But I do think that there's a cue being taken by this administration that there's a way to kind of very quickly resolve to a positive outcome with respect to immigration and crime. But I do think Gavin's point is right, that we do have to have some boundary conditions, particularly as it relates to human rights that we do value here in this country. And as long as there's a court trial, as long as there's a judge, as long as there's some sort of, it doesn't need to be a jury of peers, but as long as there's some evidentiary hearing to make the determination that someone is, likely this criminal, it makes sense. But again, I'm much more in favor if there's going to be forced movement of people, I don't think that they should necessarily be moved into a prison as much as moved to a port of departure and have them tried in another country if there's a crime, or we try them here and put them in prison.
I agree so much with what you just said. Due process is important. Like America, like human rights are a core American value. And it was great you acknowledged that the outcome in El Salvador was good. Homicides down 99.9%, lots of lives saved. And just, there needs to be a balance. But
yeah, if we could reduce homicides right down to 1% of the level that they're currently at, I think that would be a fantastic idea. Right? I think what El Salvador has done is amazing.
Between these.
Yes.
Then let me ask you guys a question, very pointed question. If you guys could implement an El Salvadorian style incarceration system tomorrow, and it would have the exact same effect on American crime. So cuts it by 9 with and I'll give you, there's a 4 or 5% error rate. Would you do it? Would the benefit of the safer society be outweighed in your minds by the error rate or not?
Absolutely not.
Most people would say yes.
I would say yes, particularly if the errors are made with regard to people who are not citizens. Right? I don't want a judicial system that releases 20 murderers for prevention of one person being unjustly punished. Right? The amount of violent crime that we have in this country is absolutely staggering. It is a significant reduction of our quality of life. Right? So I'm all on board with making the primary focus of America's political and legal system the well-being of its own citizens. And if this requires some toughness and harshness and even a lack of fairness with regard to people in the country illegally, right, then so be it. Right? Let's make life better for American citizens. That should be the primary purpose of our government.
Yes, because they would view it wouldn't affect them. And then the 2 to 5% of people who have family members who are innocent get locked up.
I get that. I'm saying, what do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't compromise that value.
Yeah, we don't want to compromise that value. It's incredibly dangerous. Yeah, incredibly dangerous. We've been riding on a bit of a high, and I think there's a couple of things here this administration could do better. And communicating when they make a mistake, and then human rights is such a core part. I believe, Jason Calacanis, believes that there is a sedition.
What about the human rights of American citizens? All right, I think that should be our primary concern. All right, I can name you one tiny part of the political spectrum that has been right about almost everything over the past 50 years. Right? Do you realize that Paleocons have been right about virtually every major American political issue over the past 50 years? I would think that's significant. I think that'd be worthy of study. I think that would be worthy of veneration. I think that should be influential in how we look at politics. Right? I asked Grok, have the Paleocons been wrong about anything important? And Grok tells me the Paleocons have been wrong about important issues, particularly their views on race and civil rights. Right? I don't agree. All right? I think different peoples have different gifts, and the extension of this highly intrusive government regulation of our private and professional lives in the name of civil rights has overall made this nation less cohesive, less trusting, more litigious, more at odds with each other. Right? That the Paleocons were right in their opposition to civil rights legislation, because with civil rights, as the terrific Christopher Caldwell book, The Age of Entitlement, pointed out, the Civil Rights Constitution has replaced our traditional Constitution, because with all this civil rights legislation, it severely reduced our previous rights to freedom of association and freedom of the use of our property. Right? And I think the Paleocons, largely isolationist or at least restrictionist American foreign policy, was overwhelmingly right. I will give you that the 1991 Gulf War, that maybe the Paleocons were wrong in that. So who are the Paleocons? All right, they are a subset of conservatism. They emphasize tradition, limited federal government. They are more in favor of states' rights, and they are skeptical towards globalism and immigration. Right, they opposed the 1991 Gulf War. All right, that was a successful military operation, largely achieved its objectives. I would think that the ratio of what Paleocons have gotten right to what they've gotten wrong is something like 20-1. Right? It's incredible how often the Paleocons have been right and how rarely they've been wrong. Right? They were for immigration restriction. They did not worship at the altar of free enterprise or capitalism or free trade. Right? They thought there were more important values, such as the well-being of the nation, the well-being of people. Right? I think their opposition to immigration was right. I am open to the idea that their more protectionist trade policy positions may well be right. I think they were right in wanting to limit the size of federal government. Right? I like their promotion of a Southern traditionalist worldview focused on localism, states' rights, and skepticism of abstract theory and centralized power. Paleocons are just consistently right. And the best explication of the Paleocon perspective can be found at Chronicles magazine. They were right about opposing immigration, especially from non-Western countries. They've largely been right in promoting a more restrictive, and you can call it isolationist foreign policy. May well be right with protectionism in trade. They're right in their adherence to traditional moral values, often rooted in Christianity. right? They're skeptical of big federal government, federal enforcement, the promotion of litigation through civil rights legislation. All right, they are for people having the right to freedom of association and to the use of their own property. Right? They just have such an incredible track record. And so Trump is doing great things, largely to the degree that he aligns with Paleocon policies, such as immigration restriction and reconfiguring our trade policies. Right? Pat Buchanan was a great man, and Pat Buchanan was right.
After that day we met, and I think we've been friends for 20 years. It reminds me of the last line in Casablanca when Louis walks out and Humphrey Bogart said, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful relationship. And it has been for me. I was once in...
So this is what I started watching this morning when I thought, my best self does not listen to pundits, right? Does not spend time with Victor Davis Hanson, even though he's about the best pundit articulating what's going on with Trump and the nation.
Embedded in Iraq during the surge twice in 2006 and 2007, and I was talking to a Black Hawk pilot about what the problem was with the disparity, why we could not translate tactical brilliance and victories to strategic resolution. And he says, well, we are a postmodern society fighting a pre-civilizational society. And you're not supposed to talk about that cultural differences. But I said, well, explain what you mean. And he said, every night I have a master's degree from West Point, but every night I text my wife in Maryland and I go over the 3 kids' homework in between flying in combat. And he said, if the other night I was almost shot down, I would have dropped right on the people who were shooting at me, maybe taken them out. But my loss would be interpreted in the United States as a tragedy, given my education, my wealth, my family. They would all be written up. What am I doing in an odd, God-forsaken place like Fallujah when I should be home with my kids? But the people who would shoot me down were probably 11.
Okay, that's an interesting anecdote there from Victor Davis. Peter Brimlow is now on Substack, and he points out Paleocons were right about immigration. Right? Paleocons for decades have warned about the problem of unchecked immigration, and for that they've been slandered, cancelled, and blacklisted for daring to tell the truth. Right? Paleocons have such an impressive track record. Right, so Peter Brimlow grew up in Britain, and then he moved to Canada, and then he moved to America, and he naturally feels the need to respect the traditions of his host nations. And back in 1982, Peter Brimlow was working for Fortune magazine, and they had this peculiar medieval guild structure. It meant that writers had to submit article proposals in writing to a hierarchy of editorial committees. And he says, I proposed an article on immigration, which I pointed out was obviously vaster, larger, and more transformatively, changing the demographics of the nation than advertised. And my idea was met with complete incredulity, right? None of Fortune magazine's top editors had seen immigration discussed in the New York Times. Therefore, immigration did not exist as a subject to cover, right? This was before the internet. This was before the explosion of talk radio, right? You would think that National Review would have been all over the great debate regarding the Immigration Act of 1965. No, National Review read only one article, and it was a ruthless, logical assessment of the demographic implications of abandoning national origin quotas by the late, great Ernest van den Haag, right, another immigrant. And so Peter Brimlow and Patrick Buchanan were doing the Lord's work on this issue. And so was John Tanton, right, a Michigan ophthalmologist who started FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. So starting in the 1970s, resistance to massive amounts of immigration came from the left, right? It came from environmental and conservationist movements. And these immigration restrictionist movements on the left were largely raising money from environmentalists on the left. Right? Sam Francis was fired by the Washington Times in 1995 for saying that America could not continue without Americans, which is a profoundly paleoconservative point. The Sierra Club abandoned its previous opposition to immigration because of pressure from a major donor. Right? In 2004, there was an attempt by grassroots Sierra Club members to restore its traditional rational opposition to immigration, but it was driven back by big donors. So Chronicles magazine, the paleoconservative journal, was the first to break with Conservative Incorporated and the ruling class consensus in its March 1989 Nation of Immigrants issue. Right? And Chronicle said, we might just begin to wonder what is in store for Americans. And this caused a shocking and telling reaction. Right? It was the occasion of a celebrated divorce, made the New York Times, and Chronicles then sponsor the Rockford Institute and Richard John Newhouse, who went on to found First Things, right? And he moved from a Lutheran pastor to a Roman Catholic priest in the process. The whole catalyst for this break was a letter to Richard John Newhouse from Norman Podhoretz, editor of Commentary magazine. And he denounced this Commentary magazine article as nativist bigotry. John Newhouse lived in New York, and being concerned about immigration restriction was not good for his social life. So John Newhouse founded First Things, moved away from the Paleocons and Chronicles magazine. And in the late 1990s, right, Newhouse came around. He believed that the U.S. Catholic hierarchy was dissolving its historic alliance with American nationalism in favor of a pan-Hispanic hemispheric identity. And Norman Podhoretz has also evolved. So Podhoretz, who once denounced Chronicles for nativism, in 2019 told Claremont, what has changed my mind about immigration, even legal immigration, is that our culture is weakened to the point where it's no longer attractive enough for people to want to assimilate to, and we don't insist that they do assimilate. And Peter Brimlow says that Norman Podhoretz and some major New York donors were key in persuading William F. Buckley to abruptly fire John O'Sullivan as the editor of National Review in 1997. So this ended the brief period at that magazine that featured Peter Brimlow's 1992 essay on its cover, Time to Rethink Immigration. So John O'Sullivan joined Chronicles magazine in daring to challenge the Wall Street Journal enforced immigration enthusiast consensus. John O'Sullivan said that this Peter Brimlow essay launched the modern American debate on immigration. And Brimlow briefly broke through the regime media's Iron Curtain, was even cited in the Wall Street Journal. Right, this 1989 Chronicles essay, right, was right on the mark. But in 1989, Peter Brimlow had taken his eye off the immigration ball temporarily to ghostwrite Rupert Murdoch's autobiography, which was never published. There was another terrific thinker who nailed this topic, Larry Oster. He wrote The Path to National Suicide. Right, there is no economic justification for these modern massive immigrant inflows into America. Yes, it may increase gross domestic product, but virtually all of that is captured by the immigrants themselves. Native Americans don't benefit, they are disadvantaged. Right? Immigrant wage competition shifts income within the native-born community from labor to capital. So the right throughout advanced economies has consistently been A-OK with huge amounts of immigration. Right? But the Paleocons were right. Now, to the extent that Donald Trump is doing the right thing and the good thing and the holy thing, is because he's following the lead of the Paleocons.
Sadistic nature to this administration. It is an Achilles heel for them. And when you see them doing videos from these prisons and saying, this is going to happen to you, and this prison is known for torture, and this prison is known for just absolutely the most abhorrent issues in the world, this is the sadistic nature of this administration that I think they need to drop because it is going to derail them. And people care in this country deeply about human rights and process. And there is a constitutional issue right now because Trump and this administration is disobeying the court when they say, hey, let's slow down here. There is no cost, zero cost to Americans sending these people to a way station and investigating each of these cases to make sure we don't send a gay hairdresser to El Salvador, another country, to be tortured in prison, if that is in fact the case. And it is against all American principles to not have due process and to have innocent people potentially go to jail. And what all Republicans should do is here is say, this is going to derail the administration. These are the things that will build up over time. And people, just pragmatically speaking, people in America who are rooting for this administration to do some good things, like I am, when they do stuff like this, and I represent a large swath of people, it loses them votes. And this is why I predict, this is why they will lose the midterms if they continue to do this type of stuff. That's my position. It's not virtue signaling. I've cared about human rights long before the All In podcast existed. My first job was working at Amnesty International. And this is a giant mistake by this administration. Gavin, you have some thoughts?
All right, a lot of great stuff at Chronicles magazine. Another little essay here. Out of control judge tries to silence Trump on Russiagate. So a D.C. federal district court judge has issued a temporary restraining order against President Donald Trump at the request of the powerhouse law firm Perkins Coie, restricting the president from criticizing the firm to any of its clients, regardless of whether or not his criticisms are factual. Right? The president cannot cite the Federal Election Commission's finding that Perkins Coie mischaracterized campaign expenditures on opposition research for the left as legal expenses. Right? Perkins Coie hired the firm Fusion GPS, which then procured the bogus Steele dossier accusing Trump of colluding with Russia to win the 2016 election. Perkins Coie's agents then fed the dossier to the FBI as part of a smear campaign orchestrated by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Clinton brought up the accusations during one of the presidential debates. All sorts of willing dupes within the intelligence community then sponsored the opposition research to a Foreign Intelligence and Surveillance Act to obtain warrants on Trump campaign figures. And this bogus dossier was used as a pretext to launch a ridiculous campaign of lawfare conducted by special counsel Robert Mueller. Right? This hamstrung Donald Trump's first term, played a huge role in the Republican Party's losses during the 2018 midterm. It was the dirtiest political trick in American history. It became known as the Russia collusion hoax or Russiagate. Right? And so Donald Trump validly raised these and other complaints about this law firm in a March 6 executive order. Right? The dishonest and dangerous activity of the law firm Perkins Coie LLP has affected this country for decades. And turns out that Trump is absolutely right here.
This whole debate is a question of ends versus means. And it's like, we all agree that the homicide rate down 99.9% in El Salvador is a good outcome. It's a good end. And this is one of the great philosophical questions. And it's, we can debate it endlessly. And there has to be a balance between the two. Human rights are a core American value. And I agree, I think, with a lot of what David said. But I also think if you are, going back to that homicide rate, the Trump campaign, they spoke to the mothers and the families of people who were brutally murdered or raped and murdered by people who were illegal immigrants and were convicted criminals in their home country and were known convicted criminals and somehow still were not apprehended and then committed terrible crimes that were very similar to the crimes they committed there.
Right. Moments ago, the Trump administration filing a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court asking it to review.
This is from Friday, 9 a.m. on the West Coast.
The Court of Appeals order in the Judge Boasberg case on the deportations of suspected Venezuelan gang members. This has been one of, if not the biggest legal matter that they've been hashing out in the courts, though how can you really choose? And Trump lost on Wednesday with a divided D.C. Circuit 3-judge panel. A Trump-appointed judge would have sided with the administration. An Obama-appointed judge sided with the ACLU. And the splitter was an H.W. Bush appointee who sided with the Obama judge and said, you can't use the Alien Enemies Act to just deport a bunch of people. Now, here's what's interesting. So they're asking the Supreme Court for immediate review, because right now what's happening is Judge Boasberg's order halting these deportations stands. So the Trump policy has effectively been shut down until we get a final ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court on this. And, you know, there's been no like real evidentiary hearing. Like Trump is in there saying, no, the policy should be allowed to go forward until we have our final order. This is wrong. Okay, so we'll find out what the Supreme Court does. But as this happens, a very interesting piece in the news this morning. Okay, it was, do you have it, Abby? All right, now, I don't think that's it. Hold on, stand by. The question is whether the Alien Enemies Act can be used by a president when it's not technically a time of war, meaning war hasn't been declared by Congress, but the president has used other language from the Alien Enemies Act to declare an invasion or an incursion. Now, Judge Boasberg was not convinced that a president can do that by proclamation, and that if he can, it's an appropriate circumstance here. And the Court of Appeals agreed with Judge Boasberg on those points. They're not convinced that this is an incursion or an invasion, as those terms would typically be used. Enter this piece today. It's posted on Real Clear Politics. It's by Bart Marquis, C-O-I-S. And he makes the strong case based on another piece of journalism he had witnessed, that Tren de Aragua is indeed, it qualifies as a military incursion that's been unleashed on us by the Venezuelan government. And he goes through it in great detail, guys. He says, there was an extraordinary article last week by Miami Herald investigative reporter Antonio Maria Delgado. And Delgado interviewed a team of high-level investigators and analysts who had been following the Venezuelan regime for over 10 years. The only team member to speak on the record was Gary Berntsen, among the most highly decorated CIA veterans in recent history. The author here spoke with Berntsen as well. He confirmed that Tren de Aragua was purposefully sent into the U.S. to destabilize our country by the Venezuelan government. Quoting Berntsen here, the Venezuelan regime has assumed operational...
Look, the purpose of the Constitution, the purpose of law and order, the purpose of due process, the purpose of our government, the purpose of our law enforcement is to protect Americans, to protect the prosperity and the safety of Americans. Right? That should be the number one goal, not to protect gang members from a foreign country in this country illegally.
Control of these guys, Tren de Aragua, and has trained 300 of them. They have given them paramilitary training them to fire weapons and how to conduct sabotage. They have given them all a 4 to 6 week course. They put these 300 guys through that course, and then they were deploying them into the United States to 20 separate states. And the Berntsen confirming to the author here that sabotage includes arson, taking a look at the LA wildfires, the cause of which we still have not yet determined, and so on. The CIA, he says, doesn't have this information, according to Berntsen, because they refused to look at it. We tried to brief them about this 3 years ago. They were directed by the Biden administration to ignore it. And now those officials are trying to undermine President Trump, who listened. I have to tell you, as a lawyer, this is a very important addendum to this argument. And if they can just get a hearing in front of this court to justify Trump's declaration of invasion or incursion, I'll start with you, Anna Spicer, it could be a game changer.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that. I'm sure as a lawyer, you know the case I'm going to cite, common sense versus nut job, where it very clearly the court ruled that you shouldn't have to argue that hard to get known gang members out of a country who came here illegally. I mean, this is on its face an insane idea that a president of the United States has to go all the way to the Supreme Court to argue that people who are known gang members coming illegally into the country have to go through some serious process to get sent back. I believe the court will side with President Trump, but I think it's sad that we actually had to go to this level to do it.
Mm-hmm. This clearly has the support, I think, of most Americans. The deportation plan in general, Mark, has the support of most Americans. Maybe they've got some questions on Tren de Aragua, but if so, that hasn't manifested in any polls I've seen. I think, the more dangerous the potential illegals are, the more Americans want them gone. But you tell me how you see it, because as a legal matter, it's tricky, but I think Trump's in the right. But the biggest matter will be politically. If the Supreme Court doesn't uphold the D.C. Circuit and allows Trump to do this, how does it play? And if they don't allow Trump to do this, how does it play?
Well, Henry, common sense versus nut job. There's always in the law, right? There's always ambiguity, and we don't know how any of these judges or justices will rule. When you add in the overlay of politics, it becomes more complicated. I think there's two important things here. One, you've illuminated, which is super important, which is the actual facts. If those facts are true, you'd have to make it akin to the president striking the Houthis. No federal judge is going to say, I'm enjoining the president from striking the Houthis, because this is, for most Americans, and as a practical matter, it's every bit as urgent a war, in some ways more urgent, because it's right here at home, than the president trying to clear up the shipping lanes in the Middle East. So number one, the facts matter, and if those facts are close to true, he should be unshackled to do this. And these district court judges, I think, should show some humility about what they're interfering with, and stop acting like this isn't urgent. Number two, as someone who had federal litigation that lasted 20 years, I know full well how slow the wheels of justice grind. In this case, I urge every district court judge, every appellate judge, every Supreme Court justice to think about these cases and not treat them all like they're on the same conveyor belt of slow molasses moving. This one should get expedited and ruled on, so the president can deal with not just fulfilling a campaign promise, but dealing with something that's threatening the life and liberty and property of Americans, which is, yes, akin to a war.
Here's how the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals saw it, Dan. They said, we understand that the government is arguing that we've had these unwanted illegals come into the country unlawfully, and you're calling it an invasion or an incursion. But the court said those terms, as used in the statute, must be considered in their military sense. Now, already, as a lawyer, I'm thinking, okay, that's fine. Who has the ultimate say on military calls? It's the commander-in-chief. It's not Judge Boasberg. And it's not even the U.S. Supreme Court. And if you read the terms of the Alien Enemies Act, it specifically says that. I mean, the Supreme Court's already said we don't have jurisdiction to review commander-in-chief calls under this, but under very limited circumstances, they can review a couple of pieces of it. So in any event, that's what they said, first of all. Those terms, invaded or incursion, has to be considered in the military sense. And then they go on to say, okay, these words in the statute must be read to mean, quote, a hostile encroachment by a nation state, and concluded that these conditions do not exist because we haven't had a hostile encroachment by a nation state. Now, if this stuff about Tren de Aragua is true, that's a very different story. And Judge Boasberg had no right to shut down the commander-in-chief's call on this just with his pen. He hasn't had an evidentiary hearing at all. He shut it down saying, I believe they're going to win. And the D.C. Circuit Court said, yeah, us too. And now if the Supreme Court doesn't step in, this whole policy could be shut down, even though the Venezuelans really may be trying to send an incursion into the United States because Judge Boasberg thinks he knows better.
Look, Democrats should not ever be on the side of criminals who are illegal immigrants. And I think the issue of immigration has bedeviled the party now for the last 8 or 9 years. And I think to Sean's point, we have been on the wrong side of common sense issues the last couple months. And so I think the party's probably best path here is to support the crackdown on criminal illegal immigrants and just say, look, the justice system should work this out. We have rules and processes in place. Let's let it work its way, but not try to kind of like spike the football and look like we are on the side of protecting criminal illegal immigrants. It is in everyone's interest to get them off the streets. To Mark's point, poll after poll, here where I live in New York City, down in DC, they had the big arrest earlier this week. MS-13 has been terrorizing parts of DC where a lot of Democrats live for the last 10 years. And so where they're doing this, we should applaud Trump's efforts to try to clean up the streets and make America safer.
Absolutely.
Now, I opened the show talking about Elon on with Bret Baier and some members of the DOGE team last night. And, I did wonder in watching it, why didn't we see this earlier? These guys are amazing. This is exactly, we should all be on our hands and knees at night thanking God that men, and I presume there are women too, they weren't on the set last night, are willing to take time off from their real jobs and real lives and do this for us. They were all really just public servants. Go ahead, Sean.
But to your point, the caliber of these people, when he was talking about, when Bret Baier was telling him, so you co-founded Airbnb, you're the CFO of Morgan Stanley. The credentials of these people, we talked about this a little on the morning meeting this morning, that it was the illumination of just it wasn't like, finding some buried treasure. The guy was like, yeah, we found out that the Department of HHS has 40 CFOs. 40 CIOs, Chief Information Officer. There are 4.6 million government credit cards and 2.1 million employees. There's obvious things that are like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't compute. 8,000 American federal workers can retire in a given month because that's all the system can handle, because it has to take a manila envelope going down a mine. That's how many envelopes can go down in a month. That's insane. And the idea that they were talking about utilizing common sense, technology, reforms, efficiencies to allow the government to run better. And even Elon, when it came to Social Security, made it very clear that 40% of the people who call the Social Security hotlines were fraudsters trying to steal the money of American retirees. And what they're trying to do is put processes in place to protect the American consumer from fraud. It's something that I agree with you. I was like, where has this been? I wanted to hear this for the last 70 days. And I finally am here. I was excited. I was fired up. I hope they do more, because I think that the more people hear about not only what's really goes on in government, but how it's being corrected, the more support DOGE and Elon will get.
Here's just a little bit. You mentioned this in your last answer of Joe Gebbia, the Airbnb co-founder and DOGE Digital Retirement Project guy. Here he is, Satan.
Now picture this. This giant cave has 22,000 filing cabinets stacked 10 high to house 400 million pieces of paper. It's a process that started in the 1950s and largely hasn't changed in the last 70 years. And so as he dug into it, we found retirement cases that had so much paper, they had to fit it on a shipping pallet. So the process takes many months, and we're going to make it just many days.
Will it be digitized, or how?
Absolutely. So this will be an online digital process that will take just a few days at most. And I really think, it's an injustice to civil servants who are subjected to these processes that are older than the age of half the people watching your show tonight. So we really believe that the government can have an Apple Store-like experience, beautifully designed, great user experience, modern systems.
He said that we're actually at the point where we have to train federal employees on how to retire. They have to go through a training.
It's so embarrassing.
I know. It is embarrassing. Mark, what American sitting at home is going to have any reaction to that other than, what?
It's great to have private sector people in a government who, my favorite moments was when Brett was asking them their motivation for doing it. And one of them said he's got 4 kids and he doesn't want the country to decline for his kids. They're an impressive group. And, even most Democrats will say, yeah, there's inefficiencies in the federal government. But this is an attempt to get rid of them. We talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. This is, you could call it waste, but it's really just inefficiency. And it's really not having the will to use the ingenuity of the private sector up until now to try to change these things. Al Gore talked about reinventing government, but that was in the dawn of the digital age. There's so much more that can be done now using digital stuff. And this is, again, as Sean said a couple times, this is such an impressive group from the private sector. I just hope that they're adhering to guidelines, and I just hope that they don't get shackled. They do need to move fast for all the reasons that this plan was launched.